the craziest scams in every time period. The Stone Age. Admittedly, this section is going to be rather short, for a couple of reasons, primarily being that the Stone Age is literally prehistoric, meaning that everything I'm about to discuss is essentially speculative. Also, because most of human life in the Stone Age was extremely simple, meaning that at this point, human life wasn't even able to comprehend the possibility of deception. If you had something that another human wanted, there was two options. Either they kill you to get the thing, or they die trying to kill you to get that thing. That was realistically the extent of scams in the Stone Age. Keep in mind, the Stone Age literally extends over 3.4 million years worth of history. The Stone Age contains 99.3% of all recorded human history, dating back around 300,000 years ago when Homo sapiens first appeared. So with that being said, what are some scams that could have possibly existed in the Stone Age? And let me present you a few interesting opportunities. Scam number 1, the made you look scam. Here's how the scam goes. You are a caveman, and your enemy, also a caveman, comes to ask you a question. You decide you've had enough of his antics and point in the direction that's behind him. This caveman turns around, you pull out your trusty club and hit him in the head. Now, your enemy is dead, and you have just successfully committed a Stone Age scam. In modern terms, that's not much of a scam at all. But when it comes to prehistoric humans, things were simple. Just think about that one episode of SpongeBob that took place in the prehistoric times. That's kind of what we're working with here. But besides the petty theft and petty murder of the Stone Age, I believe one of the biggest scams out of the Stone Age was actually the existence of the Stone Age itself. You see, the Stone Age primarily is defined by its use of stone tools, specifically near the very end of the Stone Age. And this is because humans using stone tools signifies the evolution of human creativity, human engineering, human development. Now, you may be thinking, well, of course, we need this human development. This isn't a scam at all. This is beautiful. This is progress. And what I would say to you is, not really. Because look where it's gotten us. As humans, we used to sleep outside under the stars, do whatever we wanted all day, go to the bathroom anywhere. We essentially lived like animals, and it was great. Just look how good your dog or cat has it right now. We used to live like them, but now we wake up to an alarm, we go to a job, we commute, we have anxiety, we have bills. Our bills even have bills at this point. So although this scam may have not taken place in the Stone Age, it definitely started in the Stone Age. And potentially one of the biggest scams of the Stone Age was that one meddling, weaselly little caveman that decided to combine a stick with a rock. And maybe if he was the one who got clubbed, we would still be living that sweet animalistic lifestyle. This first section was a bit silly, but I didn't want to leave this Stone Age out of a video about every time period. But with that being said, as we now transition into recorded history, the scams are going to be historically documented and much more serious. But this is a Trust Me Bro video, so don't expect a documentary. The Bronze Age. No, not LeBron James. The Bronze Age. Not LeBron's Age. The Bronze Age. Yes, that was corny, and yes, we're keeping it in. We are now in the Bronze Age, the beginning of recorded scams. And the scam I'm going to be speaking about from the Bronze Age involves metal fraud, and also includes the earliest ever recorded customer complaint. Let me explain. The year is circa 1750 BC, right near the end of the Bronze Age. And there is a famous copper merchant named Ea Nasser. Ea Nasser, unsurprisingly, would buy and sell metals, specifically copper. And this merchant was no stranger to customer complaints, with one of the most famous examples coming from a customer named Nani. Nani's specific issue with Ea Nasser was that Ea Nasser was selling bad quality or low quality copper, and that was a big issue for Nani. Unlike the Stone Age, I'm not just making this up. This transaction and subsequent complaint is recorded in commercial tablets. These tablets were actually unearthed with a group of other tablets recording transactions and complaints about the copper quality. And these were all found in a home that was believed to at one point been owned by Ea Nasser, which is by itself just a really cool piece of history. Ea Nasser was a well-known copper merchant in his city and was even a member of an established and, relatively speaking, respected copper guild, meaning that he wasn't just any Joe Schmo. However, these credentials definitely didn't help him with his business dealings, because although he may have been surrounded by proper, integral copper merchants, Nasser was likely nothing of the sort. And this is proven by the famous tablet sent to Nasser from Nani. which has actually been translated, and I'm about to read exactly what Nani said to Nasir, and I'll let you decide whether or not Nasir was a scammer. The tablet reads as follows. When you came, you said to me as follows. I will give Gimosin fine quality copper ingots. You left, but then you did not do what you promised. You put ingots which were not good before my messenger and said, if you want to take them, take them. If you do not want to take them, go away. Who do you take me for, that you treat someone like me with such contempt? I have sent as messengers gentlemen like ourselves to collect the bag with my money, but you have treated me with contempt by sending them back empty-handed several times. And that through enemy territory. Is there anyone among the merchants who trade with Dilmun who has treated me in this way? You alone treat my messenger with contempt. On account of that one trifling mina of silver which I owe you, you feel free to speak in such a way. While I have given to the palace on your behalf 1,080 pounds of copper, and Shubi Abum has likewise given 1,080 pounds of copper, apart from what we had both had written on a sealed tablet to be kept in the temple of Shamash. How have you treated me for that copper? You have withheld my money bag from me in enemy territory. It is now up to you to restore my money to me in full. Take cognizance that from now on I will not accept here any copper from you that is not of fine quality. I shall from now on select and take the ingots individually in my own yard, and I shall exercise against you my right of rejection because you have treated me with contempt. That was long, but I wanted to give you the exact full quote because I think it's extremely interesting, and I think that Nani's being rather patient and has more than enough reason to be upset. To summarize, Nasir, at least to Nani, is selling low quality copper, and not only is he selling a low quality product, but he's promising a high quality product, and when questioned by the servants that are going to pick up the product, he is not nice at all. He's very combative within these transactions, and not only that, he's also refusing to give a full or even partial refund to Nani after his complaint, and Nani has sent multiple messengers to collect a refund. And what does Nasir do? Turns him away empty-handed and sends him through enemy territory to risk the life of the messenger just to add insult to injury for Nani. I don't know about you, but if I was Nani, I would definitely be sending somebody else to Nasir's door that wasn't a messenger looking for my money back. But even after all of this, Nani isn't even refusing to deal with Nasir anymore. He's just saying that once he gets the copper from Nasir, he's going to go through and verify the quality himself before he buys it, which is something he likely should have been doing, but I guess didn't feel like he had to be doing because he was buying from a merchant in the Copper Guild. But lesson learned on Nani's part, check your metal as you buy it. So yeah, this one tablet that was found thousands of years after it was created went on to solidify Nasir as one of the most notorious Bronze Age businessmen and scammers. The Iron Age. The Iron Age is a very interesting time period, and it represents a change of power, at least in the world of metals, as the Iron Age literally represents iron becoming the prominent metal that is being mined, forged, and fashioned into tools and ornaments and armor. And the reason that transition was made is kind of a long story, but the transition from Bronze Age to Iron Age was harsh, and humanity as a whole took a step backwards before it could take 2 steps forwards as it transitioned from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. However, the Iron Age is not free from scams, and it itself has a very interesting laundry list of scams that took place, with the one that I'm going to focus on involving silver coinage, debasement, and hyperinflation. Admittedly, the scam I'm about to discuss kind of bleeds out of the Iron Age, but I had other scams I wanted to associate with other time periods, so although this specific scam doesn't take place in the Iron Age, it definitely has its roots in the Iron Age. So I'm going to allow that technicality to make this work, because trust me, we do have some crazy scams coming up. The Iron Age is when we truly see the rise of coinage being used. During the mid to late Iron Age, we see coins being minted and being transacted with, which during this time in history, circa 600 BC, is a relatively new methodology of transacting, because up until this point, all of commerce was conducted through trade, one good for another. There was no store of value. It was simply merchandise for merchandise, no currency of any sort, at least in the form of coinage. Prior to coinage, precious metals were definitely the currency of choice, but they weren't necessarily currency, just something of value to most people, and a good way to store value efficiently, as they were non-perishable and value dense for the most part. Now, even during this time in the late Iron Age, these coins that were being made weren't even used for transacting yet. They were primarily religious objects, typically used as badges or medals. But it didn't take too long for these people that were creating these interesting, valuable medals to create something that had trade value. Specifically with ancient Greek coinage being minted by the Ionian Greeks in the late 6th century, right at the ass crack of the Iron Age. And it is believed that these ancient Greek coins were the first coins ever to be used for transacting on a large-scale basis, and they were made primarily of small silver fractions. But this recent innovation of commerce spread like wildfire through the 5th and 6th century BC and quickly became the standard, primarily being pioneered by the ancient Greeks and other empires of the time. But this in itself isn't the scam, it's simply the context for the scam that we are about to discuss. This context is important because it anchors us to the Iron Age, although what we're about to discuss happens slightly after the Iron Age and involves actually the Roman Empire. During the Iron Age, ancient Rome is established, and during the end of the Iron Age, the Roman Republic is established. And during these times, the innovation with iron is giving Rome a lot of strength and a lot of military capability. And due to the rise of ancient Rome and then the Roman Republic, we find ourselves with the Roman Empire, which, like I mentioned, isn't in the Iron Age, but we're making it count. And it's with the Roman Empire that we find ourselves with our very next scam. The scam being coin debasement. And this one scam actually ended up being a contributing factor to the fall of the Roman Empire. By the time that the Roman Empire was established, coinage was in full effect and used effectively and worked as follows. Early coinage would be made out of pure or near pure materials, typically gold, silver, and copper. These ingots would be purchased, minted, and then sold into circulation with a face value slightly above their metal value. This allowed the government to make a small profit on every coin that they minted and also allowed the currency to keep a consistent value, as it had an intrinsic value of the metal it was made out of, while it also had a face value of only slightly above that, which everyone generally accepted. Coins typically varied in value from region to region, meaning that in simple modern terms, if you had a coin that had a face value of $2, but was, made out of $1.50's worth of silver, in your region, you can trade this for $2. But if you go to a different region where they have their own coinage, they're not going to accept your coinage at face value, but they'll take it at intrinsic value, meaning that your $2 coin in this new region is now worth $1.50. And this system actually incentivized local trade, as you are going to get the most bang for your buck. But the scam we are going to discuss is the debasement of coin that happened when the government wanted to inflate the number of coins that they could produce, and they tried to do so rather sneakily. There was two primary methods of debasement when they started to use this practice. When the government would mint these coins, they would either make them slightly lighter than they were supposed to be, meaning that they would mint a coin and then shave parts off of it to reclaim small scraps, or they would simply use a poor quality metal. This would save them money and make the coins that they're minting cheaper, while they would still be selling them for the same face value, giving the government extra funds. But these methods of debasement continued and began to progress and became more and more severe. What the Roman Empire began to do was start devaluing their coins by not making them a little lighter or using a lower quality material, but actually reducing the percentage of precious metals in the coins. Early coinage of the Roman Empire consisted of anywhere from 93 to 97% of the precious metal they were supposed to be. But it didn't take long for the government to reduce this number from 93% in 107 AD to 78.5% in 193 AD, and then to 35% in 254 AD, and then 20% in 257 AD, and then all the way down until 5% silver in 270 AD. The impact of this was obviously massive, as this massive influx of token supply and massive decline in intrinsic value of these tokens created hyperinflation, and runaway hyperinflation actually happened multiple times throughout the Roman Empire. As I mentioned before, most of this debasement would happen to fund military campaigns to try to get more land, more money, more power, and they likely justified this debasement by saying they were going to collect more wealth for the greater empire. Although what really happened was prices would rise, and the value of coins that everybody was collecting, holding, trading with was dropping significantly. And it wasn't unheard of for an army to go on a campaign, get paid their money, only to realize that once they go to spend their money, the big paycheck that they thought they had gotten is now only worth a few days' meals, which obviously put pressure between the government and the army, something that no government wants to have. I think it's important to note that in modern times, the creation of money and steady inflation is something we kind of just accept, and it's part of how our currency operates. However, at this time, each individual coin had an intrinsic value, and that was the backing of its value. And even if you paid for currency in your local region and took it to a different region, even if they did not accept your region's currency, they would still pay you what your precious metal was worth, meaning that your money could never go to nothing. I suppose to put it in a modern day context, imagine if the government just said, hey, actually it's cheaper to make $1 bills than it is to make $5 bills. So all new $1 bills are actually $5. and the government just wrote a 5 on a $1 bill. You can still see that it's a $1 bill, but you and everyone else is supposed to act like it's a $5 bill. That's going to create some suspiciousness. And even that, admittedly, is a bad analogy, because the currency that we use today all has the same intrinsic value of nothing, at least not in its physical form. With early coinage in the Iron Age, there was forgery, debasement, and fraud. But I wanted to cover the hyperinflation of the Roman Empire because I thought it was a great summary of what was brewing in the Iron Age at a major historical scale. And while the Roman Empire did not exist in the Iron Age, ancient Rome did. And I'm making this point abundantly clear to prevent any sort of misinformation. And truthfully, the hyperinflation of the Roman Empire was the best example of coin debasement I could find. So I decided to take a story out of the future and apply it to the Iron Age to make the section the best it could be. So yeah, Rome was formed in the Iron Age, coins were formed in the Iron Age, but likely the most famous example of coin debasement and hyperinflation happened a little after and involved the Roman government literally scamming its people by making the currency cheaper and worse while still maintaining the same face value. And well, it backfired on everybody. The Classical Era. Although we are now in the Classical Era, the scam that we're about to discuss is anything but classy and actually contains what is believed to be the first instance of insurance fraud, which is just great to hear that people have been committing insurance fraud for thousands of years. Perhaps insurance fraud is just in our DNA. In the Classical Era, there was a man in ancient Greece known as Hegestratos, and he was a little bit of a knucklehead. During roughly 5th century BCE, near the beginning of the Classical Era, maritime trade was booming. Hegestratos was a ship owner and was profiting from this maritime trade that was taken off. And because he had a big and beautiful and shiny ship, he decided that it would be wise to get insurance, which he did. And this insurance not only covered his cargo, but also his ship on any given sea voyage. How it would work is lenders would lend money to these seafarers using the ship and its loot as collateral. The lender would say, hey, your boat is worth 2 gold ingots and everything in it is worth 5 gold ingots. Great, I'll give you 7 gold ingots. If you come back from your journey of trade with 10 ingots worth of stuff, that's great. Give me 9 ingots. That means I make a 2 ingot profit and you make a 1 ingot profit. But if your ship sinks while you're on this voyage, you don't have to give me anything. That's essentially how the insurance existed, and this helped mitigate the risk for the seafarer and also gave these lenders the opportunity to make money with some risk, but obviously nobody was going to be incentivized to sink their own ship or not come back with loot. The whole point of the voyage was to make money, right? That's where Hegestratos comes in. Hegestratos realized that he didn't actually need to go on any adventures at all, and he didn't even need to fill up his boat with loot. What Hegestratos ended up deciding to do was he would fill his ship with things that looked valuable, and what he would typically do was fill crates with sand, cheap ornaments, with sometimes boxes of valuables on top to make it appear that the whole ship was full of valuables, when in reality there was a layer of valuables on top of a lot of boxes of basically garbage. This would make the ship appear heavy and full and also give creditors a good reason to give him a good insurance policy. Already, Hegestratos was scamming because creditors would give Hegestratos an inflated value, essentially. If Hegestratos was able to convince creditors that his boat was worth at least 2 gold ingots and the contents of his boat were extremely expensive dyes and spices and metals, maybe they would say that the contents of his boat were worth 10 gold ingots, when in reality it was only worth 2 gold ingots when the rest was dirt and sand. That is obviously a scam. But now, sure, Hegestratos has a bunch of gold ingots, but he also has debt, and he's not going to go sail away and make money off of dirt. So what does he do instead? Well, he would go take this boat and deliberately sink it. Now, all of the money that the creditor had given him was his money, fair and straight, and he really was out nothing, and he could continue this plan over and over. And it wasn't long before Hegestratos' scam was exposed. And this kind of shocked the ancient Greek world, because during this time, there was integrity and respect for the law and understanding when it came to commerce. And such a fraud was not even necessarily thought of. But when this scam was exposed, it kind of exposed the vulnerability in these early financial contracts and how people could manipulate things in a way that may seem counterintuitive, but would ultimately be beneficial for the scammer. The case of Hegestratos is considered to be one of the biggest scams of the Classical Era. Not only because it was just so ballsy, but also because it was the first instance of insurance scam and kind of gave the entire insurance industry a huge shakeup and a wake-up call for how they had to protect themselves moving forward when they were crediting people who could potentially screw them over. So yeah, the Classical Era, I'm sure, had more scams than you could count, but I definitely think the case of Hegestratos is one of the most interesting and definitely one of the most defining of this time period. The Medieval Era. I don't know about you, but I feel like the medieval era is definitely one of the most interesting parts of history. You have castles, knights, kingdoms, wealth inequality, and a plethora of scams. What is there not to enjoy? It was honestly a bit tough to pick just one scam for the medieval era, but I'm happy with the one I chose, so let's get right into it. There's no doubt that in medieval times, the Christian religion was everything. And this is kind of proven by all of the art, architecture, writings, everything was the Christian religion. And with every fan base comes collectors. And while the Christian religion didn't necessarily have marketable plushies at the time, they definitely had a huge underground market for relics. And these relics were definitely odd, to say the least. Potentially the most famous Christian relic would be the Holy Grail, but it's definitely not the only relic that people were interested in getting their hands on, with some of the most popular and sought after ancient relics being the literal bones of saints. Like, let's say there was a famous saint who was very prolific and known in the church. Well, once they die, if you could get one of their bones, you could possess their magical powers. Like, literally, that was the mindset. Merchants and other saints and even individuals wanted these bones for a plethora of different reasons. Wealthy individuals would typically want to collect these relics to help make their own desires and dreams come true, as these Christian relics were believed to essentially cause miracles. And in that instance, if there was an object that could bless you, that could make all of your dreams come true, that could protect your family and defeat your enemies, is there really a price you wouldn't pay for them? But here's the thing. Not many people had this money at all. And what people resorted to was visiting churches that had these relics so that they could gain the power and benefit of them from a fraction of the price. And that's exactly why bishops and priests would collect these relics. Obviously, they would see the value of these blessed items that could provide miracles as something that they would want to have in their life and in their church, but they also noticed that any church with a relic was gaining more foot traffic, more donations, and became more or less of a landmark and a hotspot for pilgrimages. And this is where the business opportunity arose. Merchants, whether they believed in the power of these relics or not, if a merchant was able to get their hands on a relic at a decent price, they could sell it to almost anybody with money for an astonishing profit. Here's the issue. As the popularity and demand grew for relics, the supply didn't really. Which was great for investors because, supply and demand, but that also gave incentive for others. The only way that a relic could really even be brought into this underground market was by a crusader who would go and reclaim the relic from the Holy Land, or a merchant who would do business in the Holy Land, hopefully trying to get a relic or something close to a relic that they could buy cheap and sell for a massive profit back in Europe. But these two methods were slow and could not keep up with demand whatsoever, which is why some interesting individuals decided to help contribute to that supply chain issue. Here's the deal. Obviously, these relics have absolutely no certificate of authenticity or receipt or any sort of tracking on where they came from. It's essentially just word of mouth. So if you were a respected or authoritative or even just a charismatic figure, you could kind of pass off anything as a relic with enough convincing. And that's exactly the scam that we are going to discuss. Fake black market Christian relics. Some famous examples of this would be fake bones. For example, St. John the Baptist was a famous saint that people claimed to have relics of, and these relics were his bones. But once all of the bones that were claimed to be his were accounted for and organized, it was concluded that either St. John had 3 heads and 5 arms, or some people had some fake relics. 2 other famous and common fake relics were pieces of the Holy Shroud and splinters from the cross that Jesus was crucified on. Obviously, any part of either of these items would have extreme significance to history, and even the tiniest morsel of either of these items would be massively valuable. And for that reason, people decided to make their own. At the time, the only way that these relics could be verified is if they actually had provable miracle abilities. So if a church had a relic in it and somebody with a disability was healed, or a sick person was made healthy again, or a dying person was living longer, or a poor man came into money, if any of these happened after somebody encountered the relic would have been proved real. And the people who had experienced miracles from these relics would go and tell their friends and their family, essentially marketing the church that had this relic in-house. But even with that being said, who's to say if these people had experienced miracles from genuine or non-genuine items? It really kind of gets messy from there. Once the industry of fake relics began to become exposed, it was almost a running joke at the time that if they bought all of the splinters being sold from the cross, they would actually be able to build a warship out of all of the wood. If anybody tries to sell you a piece of wood telling you that it came from the cross that Jesus was crucified on, I would probably pass, or at least confirm it can do miracles before you buy it. The Renaissance era. If you've watched any of my time period videos, you would know that I've actually never covered the Renaissance era by itself, mostly because the time period itself is short and kind of similar to the era that took place before it. One of the most famous figures to come out of the Renaissance era was Michelangelo, likely most famous for his statue of David. But did you know that he got his start by scamming? Circa 1496, Michelangelo sculpted a marble sleeping Cupid. It was an extremely lifelike and beautiful sculpture that highlighted exactly how talented Michelangelo was even at an early age. But during the Renaissance era, art collectors weren't necessarily looking for modern art. They were looking for historic pieces, which typically meant ancient Roman or Greek statues, rather than new ones. So what Michelangelo did with this statue of the Cupid was he decided, instead of selling it for a cheaper price compared to the antiques, he decided to make his new statue an antique by intentionally wearing it down. It's not quite confirmed how he did it, but he made sure to make this sculpture look worn. And it obviously worked because he was actually able to sell it as a lost Roman antiquity. And not only was he able to sell it, but he sold it for a much higher price than he was initially looking for. The sculpture was actually sold to a cardinal, Raphael Riario, who initially was fooled, but eventually discovered the truth. When Cardinal Raphael discovered the truth and confronted Michelangelo, he wasn't upset with him, he was actually impressed, and he invited Michelangelo to Rome. And when Michelangelo came to Rome, he was given his first major opportunity in his career, and this was the actual opportunity that launched Michelangelo's career and made him the icon that he is today. This cardinal was able to understand the genius of the young Michelangelo, and was likely thinking that if he could point him in the right direction, he could create one of the best artists of all time. So yeah, as far as Renaissance scams are concerned, I think Michelangelo selling one of his original artworks as an antiquity summarizes this era perfectly. And it's kind of ironic to think that Michelangelo literally had to make his art something else to try and sell it. Regardless, Michelangelo was dope. But when he was starting out, he was definitely clever when it came to selling his art. The early modern era. We've covered a lot of scams in this video so far, but one scam we haven't covered is the fake king scam. Obviously, because you can't fake being a king, right? There's no way you can just tell people that, hey, actually, I'm the king. Not only are people not going to believe you, but you're likely going to be killed. And that's the truth unless your name was Perkin Warbeck, who in the 1490s not only claimed to be a king, but also became a serious threat for the reigning king at the time. And he gained significant backing and support. But before we get to how this entire scam ends, let me tell you how it starts. Perkin Warbeck claimed to be the younger of the two princes in the tower, which, if you're unfamiliar, the princes in the tower refers to a mysterious disappearance of two young royals. King Edward V of England and his younger brother, Prince Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York. They were both heirs to the throne of King Edward IV of England, but at the ages of 12 and 9, they were locked away in the Tower of London by their uncle, and they were never seen again. This obviously caused a lot of issues within the kingdom, but for Perkin Warbeck, this created an opportunity. Before pretending to be a king, Warbeck was born into a rich merchant class family and traveled around and spent time in Ireland selling silks before him and his friend came up with the plan to impersonate the younger of the two brothers who disappeared. As this missing person was not only not found, but was an heir to a throne, meaning that if this person was found, they had legitimate claim to the kingdom, which is definitely a title worth fighting for. Warbeck didn't just necessarily hit the streets telling everybody, hey, by the way, I'm the prince and I'm back and I'm totally good. He was very strategic in who he decided to lay his claim to, which was high-ranking government officials. He gained his first piece of notable support from King Charles VIII of France. And this is a major piece of backing to have behind you, because if the king of another country recognizes and supports you as the lost heir to a throne, you have some serious credibility to your claim. But this didn't last long. As King Henry VII, the current king, had formed an alliance with the King of France, there was no longer support from the King of France to be helping Perkin Warbeck. So we kind of had to start from scratch once again. So the next place that Perkin Warbeck went for support is actually insane, because he went to the actual sister of the lost princes in the tower, and not only did he go there to claim that he was her long-lost brother, but she bought it up. She was like, oh yeah, you are totally my long-lost brother. And now this support was likely even more valuable than the initial support, because no sibling is going to accept a faker as their long-lost sibling, right? Regardless of their beliefs or intentions, this duchess appeared to believe Perkin Warbeck, and with this support, Perkin continued his conquest to claim that he was the long-lost king. The following year, in 1493, he attended the funeral of Maximilian's father, Frederick III, where he was actually recognized as King Richard IV of England at the funeral. And it only took 2 more years in 1495 for support for Warbeck to have the throne bubbling within England. Warbeck was actually able to gather an army of 150 people and attempted a landing in Kent, where Warbeck and his small army were met with locals who were loyal to their actual king, Henry VII, and the Battle of Deal ensued. Most of this army died, and Warbeck retreated back to Ireland. But even in Ireland, he was facing issues and once again fled to Scotland. While in Scotland, Perkin was actually able to set up an arranged marriage with one of the relatives of the king, known as Lady Catherine Gordon. And now, after officially becoming royalty in some regard, the Scottish palace was open to Warbeck to gather his army and begin to plan another attack on England. The attack that Perkin Warbeck and the Scottish king had planned ended up failing before it even started. And what I mean by that is, before the battle even started, they essentially retreated. But the following year, the Scottish king and Warbeck tried again, but this time their landing was different. In 1497, support for the current king of England was low, primarily to new taxes and rising legislation. And for this reason, and because more time had passed for people to sympathize with Perkin, who was pretending to be the lost king, there was slightly more popularity for him on English soil. So this landing was met with some support. He actually was able to raise a rebellion and was declared King Richard IV, the person he was claiming to be this entire time. And at this point, it may have seemed that his plan was successful, and his next plan of attack was to siege the city, where King Henry VII was currently residing. And this siege failed, and once again, his men died, and Perkin Warbeck had to go into hiding once again. And he was able to flee successfully. Well, at least successfully because he escaped the battle alive, but not fully successfully, because the place that he ended up residing applied a lot of pressure to Perkin. So much pressure so that he actually ended up surrendering himself to the English government because he was promised a pardon if he surrendered instead of causing any more battles. In 1497, while being tried in front of the real king himself, Perkin Warbeck finally came clean about his elaborate scam and fake life. He told the king that he was not the prince in the tower and he was not royalty whatsoever. He straight up admitted to being a pretender because he was promised immunity for telling the truth. But obviously that wasn't the case. After this admission, he was kept close to the king and essentially imprisoned. And a year later, he actually tried to escape England, where he was caught and brought back, and at that point he was put ironically in the Tower of London, where the initial 2 lost princes were lost from. And it was in here where Perkin Warbeck tried to plan another escape and another overthrowing of the government essentially. That plan was uncovered and Perkin Warbeck was executed in 1499. This was a bit of a longer segment, but I wanted to go into detail because this story is literally insane. In a 9-year span, Perkin Warbeck is going from a rich kid who's just living in Ireland selling silk to, from the suggestion of a friend, dedicating the next 9 years of his life essentially on a conquest to claim that he is the long-lost heir to the throne and trying to overthrow the English king, in which he almost does successfully and ends up admitting everything and then dying because of it. If that's not a scam, I don't know what is. The modern era. Unfortunately, there is absolutely no shortage of scams in the modern day, and I'm sure anybody watching this video right now could name at least 5 to 10 scams just off the top of their head. And that's primarily because of access of information. And at least today, scams are exposed quicker than they would have been at any point in history before. But crazy American conspiracy theories that turned out to be true. A couple weeks ago, I made a video about the craziest conspiracy theories that turned out to be true. And in that video, it was kind of concerning how many of these crazy conspiracies were either involving or done by the United States government. And in that video, I said if there was interest, I would make a video specifically focusing on conspiracy theories that involved the US government. And overwhelmingly, you guys demanded that video. And against my better judgment, I made it. So in this video, we're discussing crazy conspiracies that involve the US government. Let's begin. The Tuskegee study. There's a saying that goes, if something is free, then you're probably the product. And that is something that holds very true when it comes to the Tuskegee study. The Tuskegee study was a very disturbing and deceptive study that took place in Tuskegee, Alabama. The study specifically targeted black males and how having an untreated disease would affect them. If you're curious about what that disease may be, then perhaps the other name for this study may lend a hint. The Tuskegee study is also known as the Tuskegee syphilis study. Yeah. This study initially took place from 1929 to 1931 and had relatively innocent intentions. During this time, the Rosen World Fund, a fund that essentially promoted healthcare and education to poor African American farmers, specifically about sexually transmitted diseases. The goal of this initial study was to identify the southern counties in Alabama with the highest rates of syphilis among African American males. At this time, the goal was to simply find this location and find the people within this location that had syphilis and then treat them. Still seeming relatively innocent. This pursuit was successful, and they found that Macon County in Alabama had the highest rate of male syphilis, with over 35% of men being infected with syphilis. Although near the end of 1931 is where this all takes a very dark turn, as during this time the Great Depression was in full swing, and the Rosenwald Fund, which was looking to help the poor African American community, was running out of funding. It was at this point when the Public Health Service, a part of the United States government, approached the Tuskegee Institute in Tuskegee, Alabama, to see if they would be willing to continue the study, specifically researching the effects of untreated syphilis in African American males. But they only proposed that they monitor these untreated people for 6 to 9 months to gather data and then at that point treat them fully. Remember this timeline, because we'll be referencing this later. The Tuskegee Institute agreed to do this research as they thought it was beneficial, not only for their local population, but for all Americans. And it was shortly after, in 1932, when the study began. The study began with 600 men being enrolled into the study. 399 of these men had syphilis, 201 of these men did not. Things already take a dark turn here, as all 600 of these men were more or less kept in the dark about what this study exactly was about, and they were really only being told that they were getting free healthcare, something that was hard to come by and an appetizing offer for anybody suffering from any sort of disease. Right? Not only did the government say that they were going to give them free healthcare, they also said that they were going to treat these men of their bad blood, which isn't really a medical condition. It was more or less of a local blanket term that just described general illness. Most of them weren't even necessarily diseases themselves, but symptoms, such as fatigue, body pains, anemia, and even undiagnosed syphilis symptoms as well. These 600 men were specifically promised free medical exams, meals covered by the government, and even burial insurance in case they died during the study. That alone should have seemed like a red flag, but at this time it seemed like a deal that was too good to be true, which is potentially another red flag. So consider that 2 red flags. But back to the point. For the men in this study who were confirmed to have syphilis, the government didn't tell them about their diagnosis, and they didn't even give them any treatment either. Now, at this point, you might be asking, why didn't the government simply find people that they knew had syphilis and then simply request that they have the ability to monitor them? These people already had syphilis, and the US government was willing to incentivize them, so why not inform them about the data that you're collecting? The government claimed they took a deceptive path because it was the only way that these men would have stayed in the study, and for the study to work, they needed to be closely monitored consistently over time. But it's heavily suspected that this deception was based on a lack of respect, both because of racial and economic prejudice, specifically because the study only involved black men, all of which who were poor farmers, which meant they had limited resources and almost no education as well too. And by limited education, I mean very limited, like fully illiterate. So if you're an educated and prejudiced doctor during this time, why would you give these people any real information? Just keep them in the dark. They don't know any better, right? That doesn't sound ethical to me, but I suppose that was their mindset. So at this point, you may be thinking, sure, okay, the US government wasn't fully upfront and maybe wasn't even respectful to these people that they were studying, but so what? It's not like they gave these people syphilis. These people had syphilis. All they were doing was collecting data. And while I personally would say that there is a ton of ethical issues within that already, that is not the worst part about this study. That is only the beginning of this study. After the initial 9 months that this study was supposed to go on, they decided to extend the study and extend it again. And in 1934, the first major paper about the study of untreated syphilis was made public. And if you're thinking that now that there's a paper and they can end the study and finally treat these men, you're unfortunately mistaken. And it was at this point when the study was extended once again. And there was even a push from the medical community not to treat these men, but to actually prevent these men from getting treatment so they could see the prolonged effects of syphilis. And this is where we get to the darkest part of this study. The study actually went on for 40 years. And for a majority of that 40-year period, there was actually an extremely effective and safe treatment available. That being penicillin, which was first used to treat infections in 1930, and by 1945, it was accepted as a proper treatment for syphilis. But of course, these men were kept in the dark about that, and were never offered it or even informed about it. And the government simply just decided to watch these men wither away, to see how this infection affected daily life over an extremely long period of time. By the end of the study, it was estimated that 128 of the men in the study died directly from the syphilis that they had. 40 of the men in this study also infected their wives, and 19 of these men had children that were born with syphilis. Those numbers especially are extremely disheartening because those people didn't even sign up for this deceptive study. They were simply the unintentional victim of the unintentional victim. And a lot of these deaths and infections could have easily been prevented by treating these people like they planned on doing. But instead, they decided to simply withhold treatment and monitor them for 40 years. Something that I think any reasonable person would agree is unethical and honestly horrible. Medical medical studies require consent, and the patients in the study need to be fully informed of the risks and also treatments available, and they need to be treated with respect. And with the Tuskegee study, none of those measures were taken, and it's truly a dark and shameful part of American medical history. But there is a silver lining to this story, as on July 25th, 1972, a journalist named Jean Heller broke the story about the horrific study that had been going on for the last 40 years. And with this news breaking, the government then decided that this study was ethically unjustified, and that also meant that it was immediately canceled. And the following year, there was actually a class action lawsuit that was filed on behalf of these men who were unknowingly a part of the study, and they did end up winning $9.5 million in 1973 money. So keep in mind, it's adjusted for inflation, it's around $50 million today. I'm sure for some, this money was extremely helpful and went a long way, but many of the participants never even knew that they were part of a study, never saw this money, and simply died because they didn't know what they signed up for. And even if you did live to get part of this settlement, not only is your body worse for wear for never getting treatment for a disease that they knew you had, but you also likely have no trust in the government, as they just spent the last 40 years treating you like a lab rat, and the few dollars that they were forced to throw at you only feels like too little too late. So yeah, the Tuskegee study started by simply trying to identify counties with the highest syphilis population to begin treatment, and ended with a 40-year study that completely violated not only the human rights of the participants, or should I say victims, but also the medical system as a whole. And as upsetting and disturbing as this story is, at least there was some sort of closure associated with it. This is only the first entry on this list, and we have lots more to cover. The Watergate scandal. When I first heard the name of this conspiracy theory or situation, I was convinced that it had something to do with the US government putting something in the water. But as you may know, that's not the case at all. And interestingly, this scandal is also the reason why a lot of other scandals have gate in their name, such as Deflategate, Elsagate, and a lot of other scandals that range from morbid to disturbing. So let's give a bit of context before we get into the details of this Watergate. Richard Nixon was the 37th president of the United States. He was an author, a lawyer, and a career politician. But in 1974, his presidency was cut short as he resigned for reasons that involve the Watergate scandal. This entire scandal is interesting and kind of two-sided because there is the initial acts that took place, and then there is the reaction to the exposure of the initial actions. And if you're already confused, don't worry, because I'm going to lay it out simply as possible. This entire situation begins with Richard Nixon being paranoid that he was not going to win a re-election, something that he feared deeply and was willing to do anything to avoid. This included harassing opposing journalists, politicians, and even celebrities who could potentially influence his re-election in a negative way. And he and his administration would harass them by abusing government power in ways such as auditing them and even getting them involved in strange legal disputes and more. But that's only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the situation. Prior to the 1972 election, the election that Nixon was so fearful of losing, a group of Nixon's associated formed the Creeps. Creeps meaning the Committee to Re-elect the President. An odd and kind of fitting name. This rather elusive group went to some extreme and even illegal measures to ensure that their goal was met. One of their biggest efforts was collecting information on the opposing party, the Democratic Party. And this is where we get to Watergate. This group of creeps were approved to break into and plant listening devices into the Democratic National Committee headquarters, which just so happened to be based in the Watergate office building in Washington, D.C. The group figured that if they could break into their offices and collect data secretly, they could find some dirt and use it against them to make sure that they win the 1972 election. The first time these creeps broke into the office, the mission was successful. However, on their second attempt, all 5 of these men were caught. And this is where the plot thickens, because nobody knew who these men were, what their motivation was, and what their goal was. All they knew is that there was 5 spies breaking into the Democratic Party's headquarters. Although it's not hard to think of who may have potentially ordered this attack. The FBI began to look deeply into this case to find who exactly was involved and what their motivation and goal was. It was at this point, coincidentally, when Richard Nixon would instruct the CIA to tell the FBI to halt all further investigation on this entire scandal. or at least the finances involved behind the scandal. They were still going to investigate these men, but the funding investigation was blocked. Obviously, this entire situation sparked public outrage, and there was a lot of finger pointing at the Republican Party, specifically at the president himself. And although he and his party strictly denied any involvement or awareness of this essentially spy operation, information was flowing in and the house of cards was crumbling. One of the early pieces of evidence that pointed towards Nixon was the fact that one of these men who conducted this robbery was actually a Republican aide. And on top of that, they had an informant who was feeding them information directly connecting these burglars to Richard Nixon himself. And I swear I'm not even making it up. This informant or whistleblower went by the alias of Deep Throat. Shout out Deep Throat for the information. I feel like if you called the government right now and told them you had information, but you wanted to go by the name Deep Throat, you'd probably get hung up on, but that's just me. Now, despite all of this media attention and this obviously odd situation going on, Nixon did obviously win the election in 1972. However, that was short-lived. The following year in 1973, 4 of Nixon's top aides lost their job because they were involved directly in the cover-up. Through months and months of consistent investigations, there was only more and more dots being connected and lines being drawn directly back to Richard Nixon from these burglars and from this entire scandal. And while everything was still relatively unconfirmed, it became more and more plausible that Richard Nixon not only knew about this situation, but was also directly involved. And it was at this point as well when Richard Nixon's own assistant broke the news that Richard Nixon had installed spy devices all around the White House. And while his intentions aren't fully known, I would assume he did this to benefit himself. And unfortunately for him, these recording devices actually became his downfall, as they were able to prove his involvement. When Nixon's assistant broke the news in court that these devices were installed, the government instantly subpoenaed these devices to hear the recordings that he had captured. And of course, Nixon honored the subpoena and handed over these recording devices, right? No, obviously not. He not only denied to hand them over, but he also exercised an executive privilege, stating that the president should have some right to privacy, which obviously isn't what this was about at all. Eventually, these tapes were handed over, and after thoroughly being reviewed, it was confirmed that Richard Nixon knew exactly what was going on and was even providing hush money to these creeps. The president had 2 options: resign or be impeached. And as we know, on August 8th, 1974, he resigned as the United States president. This entire situation put people in jail, changed laws, and also changed US politics forever, as it was the first ever resignation of a president in the history of the United States. This conspiracy or scandal may not seem extremely shocking at this point, because I feel like nowadays trust in the government is at an all-time low, but that wasn't always the case. And there was a point in time when people had trust and respect for the powers that be and believed that they had integrity. This situation is undeniably bad, as it's a blatant abuse of power and is a demonstration of a president fighting dirty for his own gain. And while justice was served and there was a happy ending to this story, the situation really only exposed likely something that was already going on. So yeah, the president wanted to maintain his power, did some shady things to collect some information to win the presidency, but what's considered worst of all is the fact that he not only denied and lied about the situation, but also used executive orders to prevent the truth from being revealed. Regardless, people in these high positions of power should be held to a high standard, and integrity and honesty should come first. And I hope someday we can return to that. But yeah, let's keep going. Project MKUltra. MKUltra is one of the most notorious and disturbing covert operations in all of US history. And it's for that reason that I'm going to keep this section pretty brief and try my best to make sure that I really only focus on information that you may not have heard yet if you're already familiar. This entire conspiracy theory had one single goal: to explore the methods of mind control and behavioral manipulation in humans. The reason this operation even started was because after the Korean War, American prisoners of war who were being returned home seemed to have been brainwashed, as they were consistently repeating what they believed to be communist propaganda. To the American government, this was very concerning, because they assumed this had to be the result of brainwashing from their communist opposition, which meant that if these communists had mind control techniques that the Americans didn't, then they had an advantage over America. And obviously this meant that they needed to develop their own mind control techniques, or at least explore how they would go about it. Already, we're on a pretty disturbing note, but this really does only get worse from here. It was after this discovery when the CIA, which was relatively new at the time, was given $25 million to perform psychiatric experiments on humans. At the time, this was the most hidden and secretive project that the CIA and the US government as a whole was performing. And it'll become pretty obvious why when we get into the details. The government was finding patients at psychiatric hospitals, prisoners from federal prisons, and even random members of the public. And what they would do is dose them with drugs without their awareness and then do experiments on them to see how the drugs affected them. One of the most interesting and notable operations in MKUltra was an operation known as Operation Midnight Climax, which has an oddly fitting name and essentially consisted of the US government building safe houses. And what these safe houses were essentially fake plant houses where US government funded prostitutes would lure men into these houses and then dose them with LSD where they were being observed, typically behind a two-way mirror in that very safe house. In the last section, we talked about creeps in the government, but this brings it to a whole nother level. Not only were they paying prostitutes to lure men to essentially trapped houses, they would also dose them with drugs without their consent and experiment on them. But that's still only the tip of the iceberg. Another interesting thing that they did was hosting LSD parties, which was essentially a party where music was played and LSD was unknowingly given to the participants of this party. And these scientists would simply observe these people on LSD to see how they would react. And it's believed that these ongoing tests were actually a precursor to the hippie movement, or at least part of it, which is interesting. But MKUltra wasn't just prostitutes and partying. There was a lot of medical mismanagement, most famously at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, Canada, where patients with relatively minor ailments would be taken advantage of and experimented on with aggressive drug cocktails. The main doctor at this institute, known as Dr. Cameron, pursued a concept that he called depatterning, and this concept and practice was truly evil. The goal of this practice was to reduce patients to an infantile psychological state, essentially giving an adult the mind of a child. And the point of bringing people to the state was so that the government could take advantage of this extremely vulnerable position and from that point rebuild their mind, giving them an entirely new psyche, thought process, mindset, and belief system to essentially control this person fully. Besides dosing these people with drugs, they would also put these people into comas and play messages over and over again until they sunk deep into the person's subconscious. And they even performed electroshock therapy and other forms of extreme therapy on these people as well. Disturbingly, this entire project went on for 20 years, from 1953 to 1973. And while it's not known the true number of people that were unknowingly experimented on by the US government in this 20-year period, it's likely safe to assume that there was hundreds, if not thousands, of victims of this disturbing study, many of which who were simply never the same, for reasons that they would never understand why. If you're experienced with drugs, then you likely understand how bad it is to have a bad trip, and you likely understand how detrimental it could be for someone who's never had a psychedelic experience to have an unknowing dose put upon them. That experience, for many, is likely completely mind-altering and also extremely terrifying, and it's quite disturbing how many people this had happened to. Although, once again, there is some sort of happy ending, I suppose, as in 1973, the operation was closed, once again by a whistleblower, although this time the whistleblower's name wasn't Deep Throat. His name was actually 69 Lord. I'm just joking. His name was John Marks, and he wrote a book named The Search for the Manchurian Candidate, where he exposed most of the operation. And at that point, after this information had been exposed, congressional hearings began to investigate what was really going on. And it was through those hearings where the CIA not only admitted that the operation existed, but they also were forced to admit what they were doing. To this day, there has been no class action lawsuit, no apology, nothing. And the children of some of these victims are still pursuing legal action against the institutes that they deem responsible. And personally, I hope justice is truly served, as awareness and exposure is one thing, but justice goes beyond just that. It's so ironic that after the Korean War, the US government publicly exposed and shamed these communist countries for their mind control techniques and how they could possibly brainwash prisoners of war and torture them. But almost immediately after giving a speech about how horrible these things are, they then begin not only researching their own methods of doing the exact same thing, but they go about it in like basically the worst way possible. And Project MKUltra is a massive example of the US government breaking moral, ethical, and legal laws in their own self-interest, and it's one that people have not forgotten, nor should they ever. What do you guys think? Feel free to let me know in the comments. Like I mentioned at the beginning of this video was made because of your overwhelming interest and support in the comments of the last video. So I just quickly wanted to make the same offer again. If you guys liked this video and would like me to make a part 2 about crazy conspiracies that the US government has been involved in, then please leave a comment telling me that you want part 2. I try to read as many comments as possible and I take your guys' suggestions seriously. So yeah, I thought I'd just mention that quickly. But without further ado, let's get to the last entry of this list: the Iran-Contra affair. The US is still very much in a Cold War against Russia, and is still very much so anti-communist. And it was at this time when the president, Ronald Reagan, promised to support anti-communist insurgencies around the world. Meaning that if you were a country that was currently dealing with a potential rise in communism or the threat of communism, the US had your back to make sure that that wasn't a problem. Typically by providing arms, or at the very least, training. Reagan was particularly interested in a group known as the Contras, and this group was at war with another group within Nicaragua, known as the Sandinistas. The biggest difference between these two groups was the fact that the Sandinistas was a communist group, and they were backed by Cuba. The president, Ronald Reagan, saw the Contras as a noble force, and even equated them to being similar to the founding fathers as they were fighting for freedom. Now this is where things begin to get sticky. The Contras were funding their war primarily through the drug trade, and because of this, the American government actually passed an amendment known as the Boland Amendment, preventing the US government from providing the Contras with any support due to their involvement in the drug trade. So far, this is pretty straightforward and seems reasonable enough. However, it was at this point when Ronald Reagan decided that he didn't want to follow this amendment and continued to support the Contras regardless of the amendment. And how they did this is a bit confusing, as where they went next was Iran. At the time, in 1985, Iran had 7 American hostages that they were keeping in Lebanon, and Reagan wanted to do everything he could to make sure that these hostages came home alive. It was at this point when the government made a deal. The US government, with Reagan's approval, agreed to give Iran weapons in exchange for the release of the hostages. It's important to note that this was all happening behind closed doors, because publicly, Reagan was saying that he would not negotiate with terrorists, and there was even a trade embargo currently going on with Iran at the time. But that's still only where things begin, as the US government technically budgeted $30 million to go to Iran for this terrorist negotiation, although it was shortly after exposed that only $12 million of this $30 million actually went to Iran, and the remaining $18 million actually went to support the Contras, a group that the US government was not allowed to support. This is a bit of a double whammy, because not only was the government negotiating with terrorists, something that they said they would not be doing, but they were also supporting a group that they were not allowed to support. And this was all exposed by a Lebanese journalist in 1986, and the fallout of this is where we truly see the impact of the entire situation. Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, who was in charge of most of these operations, came clean about his involvement and said that he knew it happened, he was part of it, and he also admitted that Reagan knew about all of it. This testimony from the colonel and pressure from journalists caused investigations to be launched against Reagan, not just at the time, but for the entirety of his presidency from that point on. And after these investigations, it was ruled that Reagan's involvement was more or less benign and was simply due to a lack of oversight, and because of this, he was not implicated directly, meaning he wasn't in trouble. At least until 1987, when Reagan finally testified on this entire matter. And while these hearings went on for 41 days and were publicly televised, Reagan would still not face any consequences. However, that wasn't the case for everybody. 12 people involved in this conspiracy were charged and found guilty. Those people being Robert McFarlane, Colonel Oliver North, 4 CIA officers, 5 government contractors, and Reagan's national security advisor, John Poindexter. Undoubtedly, this entire situation stained Reagan's image as a president and as an honest man. However, surprisingly, he was never impeached, never resigned, and actually left office with one of the highest approval ratings in US history, which to me either seems that people were uninformed about the situation or simply agreed with what happened, although it wasn't legal. Not only did it expose a level of distrust for the government, like in Watergate, but it also resulted in the US government literally giving an opposing terrorist organization $12 million out of a hypothetical $30 million that was supposed to be given to them, which I think a lot of people would consider to be a conflict of interest. And while obviously getting hostages home is important, giving them a proposed $30 million of weaponry seems a bit counterintuitive. Combine that to secretly funneling money to an organization that is currently trying to overthrow the Nicaraguan government that is funded funded by the drug trade, that's an entirely different can of worms as well too. And whether or not you think these actions were justified or moral, that's a decision that you have to make for yourself. But the point is the fact that the government was lying directly to the face of the people and doing things that they likely would have not voted towards or supported, which some would consider to be unlawful, unmoral, and unethical. And if the person you're supposed to trust is saying one thing to your face and then behind closed doors doing essentially the exact opposite, it's not a good look for the trust and faith in the institution that you're running. And I suppose with that, I do want to make a quick point that although this video is focusing on negative things that the US government has done and been involved with, I don't want you leaving this video with a huge doom and gloom mentality. And I think it's important to note that the government is simply a group of people, and people are dumb for the most part and self-interested. And for that reason, the government is going to reflect the people that it's made up of. That doesn't excuse them of any of its responsibility, although it's important to note that the government isn't this otherworldly thing that is perfect. It's really not. It's literally just people. And ideally, we'd have great people in there looking out for other people, but obviously that's not always the case. But with that being said, I think the point of this video and the mindset I'd like you to leave this video with is not to say that the US government or any particular government is evil and horrible and out to get you. I think it's important to note and be aware of times where the government or any institution has done horrible things, be aware of them, hold them accountable, and also do everything in our power to learn from them and prevent them from ever happening again. And the more things that we're able to expose and have out in the open, the more we're going to be able to see the signs in the future and prevent further negative things from happening. But maybe I'm just too optimistic. Let me know what you guys think.
Serial killers from every state in the United States of America. Alabama. Thomas Whisenant. Thomas Warren Whisenant was born and committed his crimes in Alabama. He was born on January 29th, 1947, and was convicted for the murders of 3 women between 1976 and 1977. He abducted, assaulted, and murdered these victims and then mutilated their bodies. Whisenant was arrested in 1977 after being caught in the act of disposing of a victim's body. He was convicted and then sentenced to death in 1978, and despite multiple attempts to appeal this decision, he was executed via lethal injection on May 27th, 2010. Gruesome start to this video, and it doesn't get much better. Also, it's just wild to me that someone could be on death row for 32 years. Moving on. Alaska. Robert Hansen. Robert Christian Bose Hansen was born on February 15th, 1939 in Iowa, but later moved to Anchorage, Alaska, where he lived a life of crime. Hansen was also known as the Butcher Baker for reasons we'll get into, and this individual was seriously twisted. He was an active serial killer in Alaska from 1972 to 1983, a total of 11 years, and unfortunately in that time assaulted and murdered 17 women, or I should say at least 17 murders and assaults. It is alleged that he has up to 37 kills and up to over 31 assaults as well. One of his methods of killing these women would be abducting them and then releasing them into the wilderness, where he would then hunt them for sport using guns and even hunting knives, which obviously plays in the name of the Butcher Baker. And the baker part comes from the fact that he actually owned a successful bakery. Hansen was caught after all of these years when one of his victims who got away led police directly to him. Once caught, he confessed and was sentenced to 461 years in prison without possibility of parole. This monster died in prison on August 21st, 2014. Arizona. Mark Godot. Mark Godot was born on September 6th, 1964 in Phoenix, Arizona. Although his time active was only a mere 10 months, the level of terror he was able to bring to the Phoenix metro area was almost unbelievable. Mark Godot, also known as the Baseline Killer, was a serial killer, kidnapper, thief, and assaulter. In this 10-month spree from 2005 to 2006, not only did he commit 9 murders, but has also committed 84 other felony charges. Mark Godot was a seriously bad guy, and in 2006 was sentenced to multiple death sentences, and now he currently awaits execution on death row. According to available data, he was only active as a serial killer and serial assaultist for the 10 months that it claims, although I find it hard to believe that Mark was simply a great dude before this time frame. One reason I believe this is because one of the felonies that he committed, mind you, one of the total 93, is a crime that involves him robbing and assaulting a 12-year-old girl at gunpoint. Scum. Moving on. Arkansas. Ronald Gene Simmons. No, not Gene Simmons, the guy your dad thinks is really cool, the guy that your dad paints his face like, the guy that your dad gets too drunk listening to and hits you, that's Gene Simmons. This is Ronald Gene Simmons. Back on a serious note, Ronald Gene Simmons was a mass murderer who killed 16 people, including 14 family members. Almost as if he was competing with Mark Godot, who committed 9 murders in 10 months, Ronald Gene Simmons committed 16 murders in only 7 days. In Arkansas during December 1987. Ronald G. Simmons was born on July 15, 1940. Simmons served in the military before moving to Arkansas, and on December 22nd to 28th in 1987, he methodically murdered his family members at his home and then later killed 2 other people and injured 4 more in a nearby town. He was arrested without resistance and was convicted of the murder. Simmons was sentenced to death and executed by lethal injection on June 25th, 1990. Gene Simmons from the band Kiss wanted to rock and roll all night and party every day. Ronald Gene Simmons from Arkansas wanted to kill people. California. Richard Ramirez. Richard Ramirez, also known as the Night Stalker, is likely one of the most infamous names on this list. Strangely, I have never covered him on the channel, even though I've made numerous videos about serial killers. Ramirez was born on February 29, 1960 in El Paso, Texas, but moved to California at the age of 22. Ramirez's crimes were heavily influenced by his troubled childhood, and he even had a cousin who taught him military skills that Ramirez ended up later using during his killing spree. That killing spree and honestly crime spree, which also included assaults and burglaries, took place in the greater Los Angeles area from 1984 to 1985. During this time, he committed numerous heinous crimes such as home invasions, murders, and assaults. His crime spree, marked by extreme violence and satanic rituals, created widespread fear throughout the LA area. And fortunately, he was caught on August 31st, 1985, where he was convicted of 13 murders, 5 attempted murders, 11 assaults, and 14 burglaries. He was sentenced to death and remained on death row until he died of cancer on June 7th, 2013. Colorado. Scott Lee Kimball. Scott Lee Kimball was a former FBI informant who was convicted of murdering at least 4 people between 2003 and 2004 while working with the FBI. Kimball was born on September 21st, 1966 in Boulder, Colorado. Kimball was a skilled forager who ran a legitimate business buying and selling organic beef, but primarily used his business as a vessel to enrich himself by passing on bad checks and other forged documents. This is relevant because Kimball would forge documents of his murder victims to make it appear as if they were still alive after they were already dead. Kimball exploited his informant status to evade suspicion and continued his crimes until inconsistencies caught up to him and he was arrested. Not only did he expose flaws in the FBI's informant program, but he was also sentenced to 70 years in prison, where he currently stays today. Oh, and if you're curious who the victims were, it was his uncle, his stepdaughter, and 2 of the girlfriends of inmates. This is almost exactly what I meant when I said that I don't believe someone who was an active serial killer was just a good person before their killing spree. This is a great example of that. Connecticut. Michael Ross. Michael Bruce Ross was born on July 26, 1959 in Connecticut. Ross was also known as the Roadside Strangler and the Eggman, whatever that means. Between 1981 and 1984, he murdered and assaulted 8 young women in New York and Connecticut. According to people that knew him growing up, he exhibited antisocial behavior from a very young age. He was sentenced to death for his crimes in 1987 and was executed via lethal injection in 2005. A fun fact about Michael Ross is that he was the last person to be executed in Connecticut before they abolished capital punishment in 2012. Delaware. Stephen Pennell. Stephen Brian Pennell, also known as the Route 40 Killer, was born on November 22nd, 1957. Interestingly, Pennell is Delaware's only known serial killer in modern history. Good job, Delaware. But unfortunately, that doesn't make his situation any better. Pennell was convicted of the murder and assault of 2 women and was suspected of 3 others. As the name suggests, he abducted most of his victims on Route 40. Pennell was sentenced to death and executed via lethal injection in 1992, making him the first person executed in Delaware in over 46 years. Florida. Eileen Wuornos. I've actually covered Eileen on the channel before, and her story is really quite interesting. Not only was she a female serial killer, but she was a female sex worker who targeted her male client. From 1989 to 1990, while she was working as a prostitute along the highways of Florida, Eileen killed and robbed 7 of her male clients. When caught, she claimed that she was simply defending herself from assault, but that story didn't quite work. Wuornos was arrested in 1991 and convicted of 6 murders and was executed via lethal injection in 2002. Fun fact about Eileen is that there's actually a movie made about her story called Monster, which released in 2003. Georgia. Wayne Williams. Williams, also known as the Atlanta Monster, the Atlanta Boogeyman, and the Atlanta Child Killer, was born on May 27, 1958. Wayne was only ever convicted of 2 murders, those being the murders of 2 adult men. But what's peculiar is the fact that he is heavily suspected of being responsible for the murder of 24 children. From 1979 to 1981, there was a spree of child murders in Atlanta known as the Atlanta Child Murders. I find it quite interesting that there's enough evidence to heavily suspect Wayne of being responsible for a very specific number of these murders, but not enough evidence to convict him. I guess it's fortunate that he was at least convicted of these 2 adult murders, but I'm sure his story would be much different if he was convicted of at least some of the child murders he was suspected of committing. Hawaii. Randall Saito. Randall Saito is admittedly not a serial killer, but he is still a killer. Saito randomly and brutally killed a woman at Ala Moana Center in 1979, and since then has been spending time in a mental institution as he was acquitted of this murder due to insanity. That's upsetting and scary. What else is scary is the fact that he escaped the mental hospital in 2017. He walked out of the facility, took a taxi to the airport, and flew to California using a fake name. Fortunately, Saito was caught days later and was charged an additional 5 years for the escape, but his escape definitely raised questions about the security lapses at the hospital. Like, I know Hawaii is laid back and chill, but it boggles my mind that in 2017, not 1987, in 2017, he just walked out, took a taxi, and took a flight with a fake name. Wild. Idaho. Paul Ezra Rhodes. Paul is one of your more or less cookie-cutter serial killers. He went on a killing spree, killed young women, was convicted of some of the murders, was suspected of more, and was executed via lethal injection. Like everyone on this list, this dude was horrible and disgusting. Illinois. John Wayne Gacy. If you're the type of person to be watching this video, then you're probably the type of person who knows who John Wayne Gacy is. He is one of the most infamous American serial killers and is widely known for his assault, torture, and murder of at least 33 young men and boys. Gacy's story is long and well documented, and I will only be giving a brief overview in this video, but if you're interested, there's a lot of documentaries. Gacy famously lived a double life as he was seen as a pillar of the community by throwing events for the neighborhood. He was a manager at KFC and then started a construction business after spending some time in jail. Gacy was known as the Killer Clown because during his community events, he would typically dress up as a clown to entertain his neighbors. Although, unfortunately, for some of his victims, he would also dress up as the clown and assault and murder them. Gacy's story is extremely disturbing and was ultimately caught when bodies were discovered underneath his floor in his basement. Gacy was arrested on December 21st, 1978. He was then sentenced to death in 1980 and executed via, you guessed it, lethal injection in 1994. If a clown ever asks you if you want to try getting out of handcuffs, don't do it. Indiana. Herb Baumeister. Baumeister is a serial killer from Indiana and was active from the 1980s to the 1990s. He is suspected to have murdered at least 11 men and possibly all the way up to over 25 men. Due to the fact that there was no trial, this is all suspected, which is something we'll get into, but it's pretty certain. Why I say that is because human remains were found on Baumeister's property. Not only were the remains of 11 men found on the property, but there was also over 10,000 bone fragments scattered across the grounds of his farm. It is believed that Baumeister would lure victims into his home, specifically gay men, where he would then assault them and then kill them before burying their bodies. Once the police caught on and began looking for Baumeister, he had already escaped to Canada, where he took his own life in a national park before police could ever catch up to him. And for that reason, he was never convicted and never sentenced. But I think he knew what he had coming. Iowa. Earl Nelson. Earl Nelson is one of the oldest entries on this list so far, being born on May 12th, 1897 in California. Earl Nelson was also known as the Gorilla Man or the Dark Strangler. He was a serial killer, a assaultist, and a necrophile, and was also considered to be the first known serial assault murderer in the 20th century. He committed over 22 murders and also 22 separate attacks all across the west coast of the United States, including primarily Iowa. Nelson targeted landladies and their daughters and would gain entry to their homes by posing as a prospective tenant. He would then strangle the victims and do extremely unspeakable things. Nelson was caught in Canada, of all places, in 1927 and was executed by hanging, not lethal injection. So there you go, something new. Kansas. Dennis Rader. Okay, so this guy is wild. Everybody on this list is a complete lunatic, but this one in particular, I just finished watching a documentary about him. He was known as the BTK killer, which is actually an acronym for his routine, I guess you could say. He would bind, torture, and then kill his victims. And that's how he referred to himself as well. He was active in Wichita, Kansas from 1974 until 1991, a huge gap. What's even crazier is that he wasn't even caught until 2005 when he was arrested and pled guilty to all of the murders. What's potentially even crazier than his time active as a killer, or the large gap after his active period where he was just still free, is the fact that he would also, during his time active, would taunt the media outlets and police by leaving detailed messages describing his crimes. The only reason he was ever even caught is because in 2004, after a 13-year hiatus, he decided it was a good time to start rewriting letters and begin taunting the police again, when at this point, technology was advanced and they weren't playing around, and they caught him shortly after in the following year, and he was arrested, like I mentioned, in 2005. He's currently serving 10 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Kentucky. Donald Harvey. This monster is a little bit different than some of the other monsters on this list. Harvey was a killer who claimed to have 87 murders, but was only confirmed to have 37. Still a ludicrous amount. He was active in Ohio, Kentucky between 1970 and 1987, a 17-year span. He gave himself the name the Angel of Death, and it all makes sense in a sec. Harvey was a healthcare worker and said that he started killing his patients to simply put them out of their misery, but said he eventually grew to enjoy killing his patients. Harvey would typically kill his victims by poisoning them with cyanide or suffocating them with a pillow. How Harvey was caught after doing this for so long, 17 years, is because the last victim he ever killed was a man who was on life support for several months after a motorcycle accident. His autopsy revealed the large amount of cyanide in his system, and then people began to grow suspicious, specifically of Harvey. They became extremely suspicious of him when they learned that he was forced to reside from a previous job in a Cincinnati hospital when he was caught stealing body parts for an occult ritual. Wild that he was even able to continue working in healthcare at all. Harvey lived in prison from 1987 all the way up until 2017 when he was found in his cell severely beaten and then later succumbed to his injuries and died in prison. It's crazy to me that someone working in healthcare with a very strange and peculiar history is able to kill at least 37 people over 17 years and not get caught for so long. We're not even halfway done this video yet, and we've heard some disgusting and deplorable stories, and I'm sorry to inform you, it doesn't get much better. So I did want to take just a quick breather before we got back into it. Okay, if you currently make YouTube videos, I want you to watch this. And if you don't, just skip to this timestamp. I get a ton of questions about how I make my videos, what I use to animate, what I use to illustrate, how I grew on YouTube, and everything of the sort. And my friend, Internet Anarchist, also had a lot of similar questions as well too. Him and I both had very fortunate experiences growing on YouTube, and it wasn't an accident or luck at all. It's my belief that success is caused by three things, not just on YouTube, but in anything: knowledge, experience, and immersion. Knowledge meaning having the right knowledge to know what to do and where to go. Experience meaning actually putting that knowledge into practice, testing it out, and learning for yourself with the proper guidance to avoid major mistakes. And immersion. Immersion meaning being surrounded by like-minded individuals that are on the same path as you, that you can compare notes with and relate to. A big problem that we've noticed in the YouTube community right now is there is a lot of people trying to sell information to brand new YouTubers who don't have a budget and don't even know any better. So they'll fall for every trick in the book, and it's extremely disheartening. Internet Anarchist and I both realized that there was something that we could do, and we did it. That's why for any of my subscribers who have a YouTube channel that are wanting to actually grow and take YouTube seriously, I would love to invite you to our new school community called 1 of 10 Community. This is a completely free community. It's always free and will forever be free. It currently includes myself, Internet Anarchist, other huge YouTubers, and over 1,400 other small creators that are looking to grow their channel and are working every day to get better and providing each other feedback and support. My goal with this group is to provide small and upcoming YouTubers the absolute best opportunity to be able to grow quickly in a way that's not a scam. Like I said, there's a lot of predators on YouTube, and not that kind of predator, that are looking to prey upon small YouTubers who have the dream of growing but don't have the knowledge of making it happen. And unfortunately, these people are typically easily fooled by fake plaques and fake screenshots, and they are sold expensive courses that don't help them. That's why me and Internet Anarchist made something that was better than these paid courses, and it's absolutely free. So before we get back into the killing spree, if you are a YouTuber that follows me and you want to grow more on YouTube, please, I would love you to join 1 of 10 Community. The link's in the description. It's a completely free school community. Make an account and join a network of a ton of YouTubers like yourself who are just trying to grow and make their dreams come true. Okay, back into the void. Louisiana. Derek Todd Lee. Lee was born on November 5th, 1968, and was from St. Francisville in Louisiana. He is also known as the Baton Rouge serial killer and is known for his killing spree from 1998 all the way up to 2003, where during this time, he terrorized Baton Rouge and surrounding areas by committing at least 7 murders of, you guessed it, women. Before his murders, he was a great guy, right? No, not at all. Before his murder charges, Lee was actually arrested for stalking women and watching them in their own home. In an interesting twist, despite this previous arrest, during the search for this serial killer, the police overlooked him because they assumed the serial killer was white. However, Lee was eventually linked to all of these murders of these women in Louisiana via DNA tests, and in 2004, he was put on trial and was sentenced to death. Lee did not end up being killed via lethal injection because he actually died of heart disease in the hospital while on death row at the ripe old age of 47. Maine. James Hicks. Hicks is the only known serial killer from the state of Maine, and information on him was not easy to find. But the long and short of the story is, in 1977, his wife magically disappeared, which caused suspicion, but not that much suspicion because Hicks was not arrested until 1983 and convicted a year later in 1984. Before this arrest, another woman went missing who was last seen at a bar with Hicks. He was never arrested for this disappearance because there was never enough evidence to connect him to it. But after he was suspected of his wife's disappearance 6 years later, they tied the two together. For both of these disappearances, he was only sentenced to 10 years and only served 6 of them and was released from prison in 1990. Once he was released, he met another woman, started a life with her, moved in with her, and 6 years later, murdered her. He was suspected in her disappearance, but Hicks was never charged with her death either because of a lack of evidence. This guy was slimy. The only reason that Hicks was caught is because he was in Texas holding a gun to a 67-year-old woman's head, forcing her to sign over the title of her car to him and then write a note you would write to your loved ones telling them you won't be around, if you get my drift. He planned to drug and drown the woman to make it look like she did it, but this woman somehow escaped and Hicks was caught for this act, sentenced to 55 years, and during this time confessed to the 3 other murders he committed and actually led the Maine authorities directly to the sites where he buried these bodies. But yeah, Maine's only serial killer was a disgusting guy who got way too lucky for way too long. Maryland. Joe Matheny. Matheny is a hilarious name, specifically for this dude, because he looks like he enjoys meth-eny. He was born in Baltimore, Maryland, and claimed to have killed 13 people, but was only ever convicted of 2 of these murders. Research later confirmed 3 additional victims through matching his confessions to evidence. So he was convicted of 2, confirmed 5, and claims up to 13. He specifically preyed on homeless men and prostitutes, luring them in with the promise of food and drugs, and actually would just give them death. Notably, Matheny dismembered some of his victims and even disposed of their remains at a meat stand where he worked. He was arrested in 1996, convicted of multiple murders, and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. And in 2017, he was found dead in his cell. So that's him. Massachusetts. Albert DeSalvo. DeSalvo, also known as the Boston Strangler, I think the 3rd or 4th strangler on this list so far, is a serial killer who confessed to the murder of at least 13 women in the Boston area between 1962 and 1964. DeSalvo would gain entry to his victims' homes by posing as a handyman. He, not shockingly, would strangle his victims to death. Very interestingly, DeSalvo was never convicted for any of these murders, but was imprisoned for other crimes. In 1973, in prison, he was actually murdered due to an ongoing debate that had taken place in the prison about his involvement with the Boston Strangler cases. So you could say justice was served, but not in the traditional sense. Michigan. Carl Eugene Watts. Watts was born in 1953 in Texas and might have the highest kill count on this list so far. Not that that's an accomplishment at all. It is just a morbid fact. Watts was nicknamed Coral and was dubbed by media outlets the Sunday morning slasher, who murdered an insane amount of women over an 8-year period. He is also suspected of being the most prolific serial killer in all United States history. At the absolute minimum, Watts is responsible for 14 murders, but at the absolute most, he is responsible for over 100 murders. Keep in mind, this was only through an 8-year period. Wild. All of which of these murders took place within Michigan. Watts would stalk his victims, break into their homes, and then kill them using various methods, such as stabbing or strangulation. Watts was arrested in 1982 and was sentenced to life in prison, where he died of cancer in 2007. Minnesota. Paul Michael Stefani. Stefani, also known as the Weepy Voice Killer, was a serial killer who murdered at least 3, you guessed it, women in Minnesota during the early 1980s. He gained his nickname from his tendency to call emergency services after committing his crimes in a sobbing, high-pitched voice. Stefani was caught in 1982 after 2 years of being active and later confessed to the murders. He was sentenced to 40 years of prison and, like some others on this list, died of cancer in prison. Mississippi, Glenn Edward Rogers. Glenn lived a very transient lifestyle and for that reason killed in many different states and lived in many different states. But for the purpose of this video, we're focusing on Mississippi. Glenn is convicted of 2 murders, suspected of 3 more, and claims over 70 total. Glenn was active from 1993 to 1995. And during that time, he worked as a handyman and also, you guessed it, killed women. You can probably guess how as well. Something interesting about this guy though is the fact that he actually was on the FBI top 10 most wanted fugitives list and was caught after a nationwide manhunt. Currently, he's on death row in Florida. Missouri, Robert Burdella. Burdella was a serial killer from Kansas City who was known as the Kansas City Butcher, or more ominously, the Collector. He was active during the 1980s, and during this time, he killed at least 6 young men. Yeah, different. He would lure his victims, who were often young men, into his home where he would subject them to prolonged periods of captivity and torture, typically including assault, and always ended in murder. After being active for 3 years, Burdella was caught in 1988 and sentenced to life in prison without parole. He ended up dying in jail 4 years later in 1992 at the age of 43. Montana, Nathaniel Bar Jonah. This case specifically is quite upsetting and disturbing. Jonah was primarily a child assaulter and was only a suspected serial killer and cannibal. And although he has 0 confirmed murders, he has 5 suspected murders and 10 plus confirmed victims that are children that survived. He was active from 1964 all the way until 1999, which is just heartbreaking. At least in 1999, he was apprehended and convicted with assault, kidnapping, attempted murder, and child assaultation, and was given 130 years in prison at the Montana State Prison, where he died in 2008. Gross. Nebraska, Charles Starkweather. This case has one of the fastest timelines on this list. Starkweather was a serial killer who, along with his girlfriend, killed 11 people in the span of only 2 months. The rampage began with the murder of a gas station attendant, and this snowballed into a series of robberies and killings, including the murder of some of his girlfriend's family members. After this 2-month killing spree, the pair was caught in Wyoming after a high-speed chase. Starkweather was sentenced to death and was executed a year later after being caught in 1959. So let me break it down for you. This guy was 18 years old, decides to go on a 2-month killing spree, and is executed via the electric chair only 6 months after being put on death row. He died at the age of 20. That is quick justice. His girlfriend, on the other hand, who was his accomplice, was only sentenced to 17 years in jail. Wild. Nevada. Carol Cole. This is the first man I've ever seen named Carol, so that's something. Cole was a serial killer who was convicted of strangling 2 women in Nevada and murdering 3 others in Texas. This is pretty typical. What's not as typical is that he is believed to be linked to at least 30 other murders between 1947 and 1980. A huge 33-year gap of being an active potential killer. Wild. Cole was sentenced to death for his crimes, and for his last meal, he had jumbo fried shrimp, french fries, and salad with French dressing, and Boston clam chowder. And the next day, he was executed via lethal injection on December 6th, 1985. New Hampshire. Sheila LaBear. In 2008, Sheila was convicted for murdering 2 of her boyfriends in 2005 and 2006, respectively. And she claims that she did this because she was sent by God as an avenging angel to Earth to punish pedophiles, which in her mind included her 2 boyfriends, whose bodies were found on her huge farm. Now you might be like, all right, I can get behind this a bit, I get it. Here's another twist. According to Brad Bailey, a defense attorney who represented her, he says, and I quote, "There seemed to be no basis whatsoever in reality to suggest or claim any of her victims were pedophiles or engaged in any of these child abusing behaviors. None whatsoever." So yeah, not only did she murder people, but she also tried to ruin their name. Sheila typically met her victims by putting out personal ads looking for farm hands on her farm. Although she was only convicted of the murder of 2 men, she also admitted during her trial that she killed several others, but these were not confirmed. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. New Jersey. Richard Biegenwald. Biegenwald was active from 1958 all the way till 1983. And during this time, you guessed it, he murdered people. In 1983, he was convicted of 5 murders, but was suspected of 8. An interesting fact is, after the serial killer died, his lawyer actually mentioned publicly that this criminal told his lawyer that he may have up to 100 victims, which is likely inflated, but the fact is this monster likely had many more victims than he was convicted for, which doesn't seem extremely uncommon for this list. Richard was actually on death row for a short amount of time, but it was overturned and he was resentenced to life in prison, where he still died in prison in 2008. New Mexico, David Parker Ray. Ray was a suspected torturer who is also known as the Toy Box Killer. This case is really interesting because he technically has 0 murders confirmed, but has 3 confirmed victims and possibly anywhere from 60 to 100 plus victims that he tortured and assaulted on his property in his toy box, which was basically a trailer beside his home, which is a movable, portable torture chamber that he had a large kidnapping and assault operation happening in there. Crazy. For the unthinkable amount of torture that he inflicted upon potentially hundreds of women, Ray was sentenced to 224 years in prison, where he unfortunately only served a few months because he died of a heart attack. Unfortunate he didn't serve more time. Not unfortunate that he died. Ray was a serious monster and is even quoted saying that he did nothing wrong to women. He only did what women wanted, and he got pleasure from their pleasure. And his assault on these women was, in his mind, him doing good for society. So he thought it'd be total sicko. New York, David Berkowitz. David Berkowitz, also known as the Son of Sam or Mr. Monster, according to Wikipedia, was a serial killer who terrorized New York City in the summer of 1976 and 1977. Berkowitz, surprise, surprise, targeted young women and couples, shooting them in cold blood with a .44 caliber revolver. His crimes sparked a citywide manhunt for him, and he even left notes taunting the police, promising more crimes. Fortunately, Berkowitz was caught in 1977 and later confessed to all of his crimes, which were plentiful. He ended up murdering 6 people and wounding 11 more. He is currently in jail serving 6 life sentences as we speak. North Carolina, Henry Louis Wallace. Wallace may have one of the most odd nicknames on this list. He is known as the Charlotte Strangler, which is somewhat tame, but he's also known as the Taco Bell Strangler. This video is not a laughing matter, but that name is weird. I guess it's because he worked as a manager at Taco Bell in Charlotte. Wallace was a serial assaulter and murderer, targeting young African-American women, and over the course of a 4-year span, he victimized over 9 women. He was caught in March of 1994 and currently sits on death row awaiting execution. North Dakota, Eugene Butler. The story of Butler is unlike anything we've heard on this list so far. He is the only killer who was never convicted of his crimes so far on this list. Eugene Butler was born in 1849 in New York State, but all of his crimes took place and he actually died in North Dakota. But we'll get into that. From the years of 1900 to 1906 in Niagara, North Dakota, Butler murdered 6 teenage boys in his house and buried the bodies in his basement. Now, the twist of all this, Butler was actually committed to an insane asylum for unrelated charges where he died in 1913. The crazy part is the bodies that were buried in his house were not found until 1915, 2 years after Butler died in the insane asylum. Super weird. Ohio, Anthony Sewell. The story of Sewell is something we've heard numerous times on this list so far, so I'll keep it brief. He had a generic name. He was known as the Cleveland Strangler. He was active for 2 years, from 2007 till 2009. He murdered at least 11 women who he targeted, specifically women that were vulnerable. By that, I mean women that were either dealing with addiction or homeless. And he was arrested in 2009 when one of his victims escaped and alerted authorities. He was convicted of multiple counts of murder and was sentenced to death in 2011. Sewell died in 2021 due to an unspecified terminal illness. Oklahoma, Roger Dale Stafford. Stafford was a serial killer active from 1974 until 1978, and in this time he had 9 confirmed kills, which he was evicted of, but potentially a lot more. Stafford started his killing spree by killing an assistant manager working at a McDonald's. After killing this manager, he robbed the McDonald's for over $1,300 and then continued on his spree. His next targets were a family that he flagged off the side of the highway, who he robbed and murdered, the entire family. 3 weeks later, he robbed a sirloin stockade in Oklahoma City, and during this robbery, murdered 6 employees, most of these victims being teenage staff members. 6 days after this restaurant massacre, Stafford was found and apprehended. Unsurprisingly, he was sentenced to death, and in 1995, he was executed via lethal injection. Oregon, Dayton Leroy Rogers. dubbed the Molalla Forest Murderer due to the fact that he would dump the bodies of his victims in the Molalla Forest in Oregon. Rogers was a serial killer who was active for, once again, 4 years and targeted, once again, vulnerable women, specifically addicts, sex workers, and the like. Rogers notably was sentenced to death 4 times, with each sentence being overturned by the Oregon Supreme Court. And in 2021, his death sentence was overturned again due to new laws, and in 2022, his sentence was commuted to life without parole. Pennsylvania. Gary Heidnik. Gary was a serial kidnapper, torturer, and murderer, and fortunately was only active for just over a year. During this year, he kidnapped 6 women, 2 of which died from his torture, and the other 4 fortunately survived. One of these surviving victims was actually able to go to the authorities and inform them about Gary's horrendous actions. Gary was quickly arrested in March 1987 and convicted of multiple charges, including first-degree murder, kidnapping, assault, aggravated assault, and more. He was sentenced to death, and in 1999, he was executed via lethal injection and was one of the last people to ever be executed in the state of Pennsylvania. Rhode Island. Craig Price. I believe Price is the youngest killer we've seen on this list, with his first murders taking place when he was only 13 years old. From the ages of 13 to 15, he committed 4 murders of women in his neighborhood, and he was arrested at the age of 15. Due to his age, he was actually initially set for release at the age of 21, which to me is mind-boggling for someone who murdered 4 people, no matter their age. But due to ongoing violent behavior within prison, he was sentenced to a much longer time and actually tried as an adult. He will likely never see the light of day. South Carolina. Donald Henry Gaskins. Gaskins was born in 1933 and unfortunately had a huge span of crimes in his lifetime, starting in 1953 and going all the way until 1982. During this time, he had 15 confirmed kills and later on claimed he had up to 110. He killed hitchhikers, acquaintances, and more, and had a laundry list of charges under his belt. A couple notable things about Gaskins is the fact that when he was arrested, he was actually sentenced to death, but then was later commuted to only life in prison, but then later killed someone in prison using a bomb, and because of that was once again sentenced to death and later executed in prison in 1991. Dude literally got off death row and got right back on with a bomb somehow. Crazy. South Dakota. Robert Leroy Anderson. Anderson was your run-of-the-mill creep. He was an assaulter and killer. He has at least 2 confirmed victims across multiple states in the US, primarily South Dakota, and would typically lure victims by posing as a photographer wanting to take pictures of people. He was convicted and sentenced to death in 1984, and in 2002 died in prison while waiting for execution. Tennessee. Paul Dennis Reed. Reed was also known as the fast food killer, specifically because he targeted fast food workers working the late shift. He would rob, assault, and murder these employees, and was sentenced to death for the murder of 7 fast food employees in the Nashville metropolitan area. Reed was sentenced to death and died in 2013 while waiting for execution. Fast food employees really deal with too much. Texas. Dean Corll. Corll, also known as the Candyman or the Pied Piper, was a mass serial killer, serial assaulter, and serial torturer, and was a member of the Houston mass murders, which at the time of its discovery were considered the worst example of serial murders in the entire history of the US. Corll was known as the Candyman because his family had previously owned and operated a candy company in Houston, and he personally had been known to give free candy to local children, which is the most stereotypical and scary thing I've ever heard. And he was known as the Pied Piper because his murders would typically start with him luring people, typically with the offer of a ride or for an invite to a party. From the years of 1970 to 1973, Corll and his 2 accomplices murdered at the very least 28 victims. Unfortunately, I can't tell you how much time Corll got because he was never sentenced. He was actually murdered by one of his accomplices before he was ever caught, which may be good or bad news depending on how you look at it. After this accomplice killed Corll, they called the police and promptly confessed to all of the murders, leading to the discovery that shocked Houston to its core. Utah. Ted Bundy. If you're watching this video, you definitely know who Ted Bundy is, and I probably don't need to tell his story. But as a quick recap, he has an unknown amount of victims, but it's likely believed to be in the range of 30 to 36. He was active during the 1970s and was executed in 1989. If you want more details, watch this video. I go in extreme depth about his story. He is a great example of why you should never judge a book by its cover. Vermont. Israel Keys. Keyes is a very strange serial killer. He was extremely meticulous in his planning, but extremely random in his selection of victims. He murdered at least 11 people across multiple states, including Vermont, between 2001 and 2012. And Keyes even had a specific method of burying what he called kill kits in different locations so he could commit murder at any time. He was captured in 2012 and didn't continue living, I'm not going to say unalive because that's the dumbest thing ever, while awaiting trial, leaving so many questions unanswered about his motives and the true extent of his crimes. Virginia. Timothy Wilson Spencer. Spencer was active from 1994 to 1998, once again, 4 years, committed 5 assaults and murders, and was sentenced to death by electric chair, not lethal injection. Washington. Gary Ridgway. Ridgway was active from 1982 to 1988, confirmed, and was possibly active as recent as 2001. He was arrested on November 30th in 2001 and confessed to murdering at least 71 women, many of whom were vulnerable women, like we explained before. This unfathomable kill count made him one of the most prolific serial killers in US history. In 2001, he pled guilty to 48 counts of murder to avoid the death penalty and is currently serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. It's crazy how someone with 71 murders can actually avoid the death sentence. Whether you're for it or against it, it's crazy how somebody with 2 murders can get the death penalty, but someone with 48 confirmed at the very least can get around it. West Virginia. Harry Powers. Powers was an active killer in the 1930s and was particularly evil because he preyed upon vulnerable, lonely widows who had just lost a loved one. He would meet them on classified ads in the newspaper and would murder them for their money. During his time active, he killed at least 5 women and 3 children before being caught. He was tried, convicted, and executed in 1932. Once his story gained national attention, it was considered to be a contributing factor to people's fear of meeting people through classified ads in the newspaper. Wisconsin. Jeffrey Dahmer. Much like Ted Bundy, this demented monster likely needs no introduction. His story has been told many times, and his infamy is widespread. If you want an in-depth review, here's a video where I discuss his story at length. In short, he murdered and dismembered 17 men and boys between 1978 and 1991. He primarily targeted black young men, luring them into his home with the promises of sex or money. He did unspeakable things to his victims' bodies and was arrested in 1991 and sentenced to 16 life terms in prison, but was only killed a few years later in 1994 by a fellow inmate. Wyoming. Dale Wayne Eaton. Eaton was a suspect in a string of murders known as the Great Basin Murders, which took place from 1983 to 1997, where over 9 victims, most of them being teenage females, were assaulted and killed. Eaton was sentenced to death, but the sentence was commuted to life in prison. And ladies and gentlemen, there we have it. One serial killer from every single state. There was honestly a surprising amount of similarities across the board. Notably, at least to me, were the fact that a lot of these murderers were able to get away for 4 years. That was a pretty common trend. And every killer has some weird nickname, like the something strangler, which is the most common. It's like being a rapper and having Lil in your name. And a very unfortunate and upsetting trend is that almost every serial killer was also a serial assaultist, except for one guy. One guy, or maybe 2 of these guys, was a robber that murdered people. Not necessarily much better, but if you're anything like me, you grew up playing Call of Duty. And one Call of Duty that always stood out specifically was Call of Duty World at War. This game was undoubtedly the catalyst for my fascination with the Second World War. And recently, while doing one of my late night History Channel binges, I came across some really interesting weapons. So in this video, I put together a list of some of the weirdest and most obscure weapons from World War II. Oh, and these are going to start weird, but get even weirder. First up, we have the Krummlauf, which is a German invention. The Krummlauf itself is not a weapon, but it is a weapon modifier. The Krummlauf is a barrel extension for rifles, similar to a suppressor, although this one was curved with a 30-degree angle. Although it seems like something out of Looney Tunes, the purpose was quite ingenious. The Krummlauf was used for close quarters combats in urban situations, specifically shooting around corners and over trenches. The Krummlauf wasn't typically blind fired, as it also had a periscope attached to it to also see around the corners. As useful as this item may appear, it wasn't extremely practical because it had a few major downsides, mainly accuracy and durability. The periscope typically fastened with the Krummlauf was very susceptible to fogging up, which left huge room for inaccuracy, and the Krummlauf itself was very susceptible to the immense forces behind a bullet, not only controlling the bullet but also redirecting that bullet, and they typically were only good for a maximum of 300 shots. Personally, I think the look of the Krummlauf is one of the weirdest things about it. I think the idea isn't bad, it's just wasn't able to be executed executed properly. The Krumov is weird, but there's definitely weirder, which is why it's only the first entry on this list. Next up, we have the V3 Supergun, and super it is. The V3 Supergun was developed as a so-called vengeance weapon in order to strike back at London as Allied bomber fleets pounded German cities to rubble. The V3 cannon was capable of delivering a 140 kilogram shell at a range of over 161 kilometers. But big deal, right? Wow, a cannon that could shoot a little bit further. What's so special? Well, one of the most unique attributes about the V3 Supergun is how it achieved this enormous range, and its unique engineering. The secret to this enormous range and what made this gun truly special was the number of side channels attached to the 140 meter long barrel. These channels were filled with additional propellant which would be triggered by the shell as it traveled through the long barrel. Essentially what would happen is the shell would trigger the propellant as it would fly down the barrel, which would cause the propellant to explode, giving even more velocity. The long barrel with these channels would essentially allow the shell to be fired multiple times without even leaving the barrel. The best analogy I can think of is when you're playing Mario Kart and you drive on a speed boost. That's basically what's happening inside the barrel. To me, the engineering behind this concept is really interesting, but the weirdest part is definitely the fact that the barrel was literally almost 500 feet long. Despite all the research, development, and resources that were put into this weapon, it wasn't really able to be executed properly. During some demo tests, it wasn't able to meet its hypothetical potential, and before they were able to truly implement it, they were destroyed by the Allied forces bombing and destroying the gun. Later, smaller variants were used on bombing raids against Luxembourg, but that's not what we're talking about here. What we are talking about, however, is something the Russians did that I don't like at all. And you're not gonna like it either. That being anti-tank dogs. Yeah, this one is exactly how it sounds, unfortunately. The Russians were strapping bombs to dogs for them to detonate under tanks. How they do this? Well, in training, they would starve these dogs and then hide food under stationary tanks so the dogs would know to look under tanks for food. They would then bring these same dogs to the battlefield with bombs strapped on their backs. The idea was that the dog would run under an enemy tank and then the bomb on its back would explode. Besides this being extremely primitive and brutal, this technique was also extremely ineffective. On the battlefield, these dogs were extremely scared of these tanks charging towards them, and combined with enemy fire, they wanted nothing to do with these enemy tanks. Also, some of these dogs would go back towards Russian tanks, hiding below them, causing friendly fire. Overall, this method is completely horrible and honestly not great. This technique is pretty on point for Russian military exercises, as their whole mentality is essentially throw bodies at something until the problem's solved. But anyway, staying on trend with explosive animals, we have our next entry, which is explosive rats. This one is interesting because it was a failure that actually turned into a pretty massive success. The British military weapons design team was looking for interesting ways to infiltrate the German infrastructure. Obviously, they were getting desperate because where they landed was explosive rats. This differs from the explosive dogs because these rats were no longer alive. The rats were found, killed, skinned, and essentially taxidermied but filled with a plastic explosive. These rats would be planted in and around coal storages on German bases with the intention of having them be thrown in the incinerator and boilers, triggering the explosive and causing a massive explosion. Now, here's where things get interesting. The Germans early on caught on to these explosive rats, and the British, because of this, stopped producing them. But Germany didn't know that, and because of that, the Germans were extremely paranoid about more explosive rats and spent a lot of resources and man-hours strictly checking rats, dead and alive, on all of their military bases. Despite the fact that the rats were more effective than the dogs, and I would say arguably less upsetting, I wouldn't say that this method is much better. For our third and final animal-based entry on the list, we have pigeon-guided missiles. Yep, you heard me right. Pigeon-guided missiles. But unfortunately, it's not as cool as it sounds. The birds that your grandma likes to throw bread at isn't also a double agent. Their primitive brains were just used for tracking, which is still pretty interesting. B.F. Skinner was a psychologist and a passionate pigeon trainer who believed that pigeons could be useful weapons of war. He was ultimately able to prove his theory right, as he was able to teach pigeons how to recognize targets and aim weapons accordingly. The pigeons had specially designed cockpits inside of these missiles which allowed them to peck their way to pick the direction they wanted the missile to go. pecking up, down, left, or right to control the missile accordingly. It's strange and insane to think that pigeons can be trained to literally guide missiles, but it's also kind of unfortunate that these birds were unintentional kamikazes. What was intentional, however, was our next entry, the Japanese Fugu balloon bomb. These bombs were extremely primitive in nature, being constructed solely out of paper. These paper bombs were huge, 33 feet in diameter for the most part, and could lift up to 1,000 pounds, but all they were lifting were 33-pound anti-personnel fragmentation bombs. The Japanese released these bombs into the Pacific jet stream, which would silently carry these large devices from Japan to the US without any pilot, and the trip would take several days. Despite releasing thousands of these devices, the balloon bomb was extremely ineffective, not to mention resource intensive. It took up to 30 minutes to an hour to prepare one balloon and required 30 hands on deck to create one. During the war, there was only 6 casualties reported from the balloon. A minister's wife and 5 Sunday school children were on a fishing trip encountered the balloon near Oregon, and sadly they fell victim to it. Although for this weapon to be considered successful, it would mean the death of people, which is obviously unfortunate. It is kind of laughable how ineffective this weapon was, considering all the time and energy that went into it. Finally, we have the last entry of this list, the Pajantrum. The Pajantrum never saw combat, but for reasons we'll get into, was a fan favorite amongst civilians. The best way to describe the Pajantrum is a British-made rocket-powered wagon wheel battering ram, if that makes sense. To find a way to breach Germans' concrete defenses in Normandy, the British military devised a large carriage-like contraption called the Pajantrum. The device was propelled by rockets attached along the rim on the outside of the wheel, and in the middle there was a drum full of explosives. The goal was to have the Pajantrum speed towards the wall and break through it and eventually explode. The concept sounds simple enough and honestly kind of makes sense if you don't really think about it. But the biggest problem facing the Pajantrum was the fact that there are so many technical inconsistencies and issues. Rockets blowing off, the wheel going in the wrong direction, not generating enough force to penetrate the concrete wall. Although the general public enjoyed watching the live demonstrations of the Pajantrum, it was never brought to battle due to all of the technical inconsistencies of it. Besides the fact that all of these weapons were complete and utter failures, they all have one thing in common. They are weird. And they sucked. But let me know, which one is your favorite or least favorite? For me, the dog method was the worst by far. Okay, I hear you. So apparently 7 wasn't enough, and apparently we didn't go global enough, and maybe I didn't pronounce something right. Roll it. So in this video, we are gonna go deep, finding even more, even scarier, even more mythical creatures and folklore from around the world. Part 1 is linked in the description. Feel free to watch that after this video, you know, Star Wars style. And also, the ranking system from video 1 still applies here. Starting off with, cool, but we could vibe, and then progressively getting more scary until we reach, please don't exist, 8. Baba Yaga. Starting off with possibly the chillest vibe in the world of mythical creatures, we have Baba Yaga. And if I'm being completely honest, the only reason Baba Yaga is on this list is because I love saying Baba Yaga. Baba Yaga. Baba Yaga. Baba Yaga is a character from Slavic folklore and honestly has a bit of interesting and kind of confusing lore. So Baba Yaga is one of 3 sisters, all with the same name, and Baba Yaga specifically, not to be confused with Baba Yaga or Baba Yaga, is described in one of 2 ways. Baba Yaga is described as a repulsive, ferocious-looking old woman who fries and eats children, and simultaneously is also described as being a nice old woman who helps out those who are lost in the woods, and if you're respectful, she'll offer you wisdom. Within the context of fairy tales or folklore, Baba Yaga is, just as I described, either a donor, which in fairy tale context means a character that tests the hero and provides magical assistance to the hero upon their success, or a villain, which doesn't necessarily require any context, or could appear as both, being slightly ambiguous with their intentions. Baba Yaga is often associated with forest wildlife, and the most distinct traits of Baba Yaga are flying around in a mortar, wielding a pestle, and dwelling deep in the forest in a hut standing on chicken legs. With all this being said, Baba Yaga is definitely creepy, specifically her horrible complexion and her murderous intent on children and her, I guess, cannibalistic tendencies. I definitely believe I could vibe with her good side, and just imagine sitting deep in the forest, in some weird hut, smoking on some wizard weed. I don't know about you, but sounds kind of cool to me, so that's why Baba Yaga is creepy, but we could vibe. I actually did meet Baba Yaga once, and she granted me one wish, so let me show you what I can do now. Look at the subscribe button. Subscribe to the channel. Subscribe to Trust Me Bro today. Did it work? Let me know. Let's move on. 7. Chupacabra. Moving to the other side of the world to Puerto Rico and Mexico with a slightly creepier creature, we have the Chupacabra, which literally translates to goat sucker, which is pretty cool. The Chupacabra is definitely one of the most well-known creatures on this list, but I still will give a quick overview of their physical attributes. There are 2 primary physical descriptions of the Chupacabra. First being very reptilian and alien-like, roughly the size of a small bear with a row of spines going down the back of their neck and reaching the base of their tail. This description is typically from Puerto Rico, whereas the Southwest American and the Mexican description is slightly different. They describe it more as a wolf that has lost its hair and has thin, tattered skin. The creepiness for the Chupacabra definitely depends on which description we're focusing on. For me personally, I find the alien-like 4-foot-tall version of the Chupacabra much scarier than the sickly dog-looking Chupacabra. Either way, they're both creepy, and what makes them so feared is the havoc they wreak on livestock. The whole origin story of the Chupacabra is that there was hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of farm animals that had similar lacerations on their neck and were almost bled dry. These attacks were uncommon from any other sort of animal attack that were common for the time in the area, therefore creating such a phenomenon. For as scary as the Chupacabra may seem, they're only in the number 7 spot simply because they target primarily farm animals, which to us really means they're not a threat. Unless you're a farm animal watching this, then I would definitely probably consider putting this as number 1. But regardless, we have a lot scarier creatures to cover, so let's keep it moving. 6. Mapingari. The Mapingari is a Brazilian folklore creature said to be the protector of the forest and its animals. The Mapingari is supposedly a former human shaman turned into a hairy humanoid cyclops. Visually, the Mapingari is very similar to Bigfoot with some pretty significant differences, those being having only one large eye, having a large mouth in the middle of its stomach, and having backwards feet so it is not as easily tracked. Personally, I think the most terrifying thing about this creature is their physical appearance. Not much is necessarily known about their behavior besides the fact that they have a smell that is so horrid that it is able to render people unconscious, and the fact that their roar is so loud it is deafening to humans. Both of those are very scary as well too, but for me, the Mapingari is most terrifying based on looks alone, which is honestly pretty impressive. Like if you were in the woods and smelt something so putrid you felt lightheaded and about to pass out, you turn around and see a one-eyed, tall, hairy creature with a mouth in its stomach and backwards feet, you would probably be terrified. Even if they didn't do anything to you, even if they just walked away, even if they handed you a free cupcake, you still would be terrified. I rest my case. Moving on. 5. Corpo Seco. Now, staying in Brazil, we have Corpo Seco, which is a dried old skeleton. Corpo Seco is a cursed person, a kind of undead that is condemned to roam the earth forever. It happens when one commits a sin that has no chance of being forgiven. After they die, his spirit is not accepted by God nor the devil. The earth itself rejects that body, as if it were disgusted by the sinner. Thus, their dry body, only skin and bones, leaves the place that they were buried to wander during the night. Their only action is to terrify those who see them. Other key elements of their frightening appearance is their long nails and hair, which never stop growing. Although Corpo Seco is only claimed to have the purpose of scaring individuals, it is very well known that the Corpo Seco is evil in nature, very evil. It is claimed that during his life, he beat his own mother to death for no reason, which might explain the whole rejected by God and the devil and the earth. I definitely believe that the Corpo Seco is creepy and scarier than anything else we've seen on this list, but one thing they do lack is a very strong capacity for violence. Some claim that the Corpo Seco has the ability to suck blood from victims to then allow them to look human again for a few days, but this seems a bit far out there, which is hilarious for this list. I definitely believe that this is the perfect spot for Corpo Seco, and I believe we might see another scarier, much scarier skeleton, half-dead zombie down the list. 4. Yokai. We now have our first Asian entry on the list, yokai. Yokai are a class of supernatural entities and spirits in Japanese folklore. Yokai are not demons, but they're not angels either. They are a spiritual entity, and their behavior can range from malevolent to mischievous to even benevolent to humans, depending on how you contact them. For the yokai, their looks vary almost as much as their intentions. They're often described as having animal-like features, such as the kappa, which is depicted as a turtle, or tengu, which is commonly depicted with wings and considered a bird of prey, although other yokai can appear humanoid in appearance, whereas other yokai resemble inanimate objects, and others resemble no discernible shape at all. Yokai are typically described as having spiritual or supernatural abilities, with shape-shifting being one of the most common traits associated with yokai. Could you imagine just like trying to show your friend what a yokai is with examples? Hey bro, check this out. What is it? Do you see that animal-like creature over there?
Yeah, it's creepy looking.
Yeah, that is a yokai. And even though it looks creepy, it's actually benevolent to humans and is pretty cool.
Oh, cool.
Hey bro, check this out.
What is it?
That is a chair, and it's also a yokai.
Okay.
Yeah, he's very mischievous and will play pranks on you.
Okay.
Hey bro, check out that cloud of undistinguishable gas in the air.
Yeah.
That is also a yokai, and it's gonna kill you.
Oh, great.
It's kind of like that SpongeBob scene where it's just like, are you Squidward? You're Squidward? Let me guess, you're Squidward. It's just like the yokai can either be good, neutral, bad. It can be indistinguishable. It could be humanoid. It could be an object. Like, you're yokai, I'm yokai, we're all yokai. To me personally, the scariest part of the yokai is the fact that they're so indistinguishable and so secretive with their intentions. They could literally be anything, anywhere, with the intention of doing anything. To me, that is just scary. And if I was in a situation where I knew I was to encounter a yokai, I think it would be mental torment, even trying to decipher what is and what isn't a regular object, and what is and what isn't trying to hurt me. For me, the yokai's scary factor is definitely within my own personal theoretical factor rather than more of their documented behavior. I just think that their abilities and their intentions are so mixed that with how strong they are combined with how much they can vary, there's a lot of opportunity for scary things to happen. And I think for me, honestly, the scariest part is the unknown in that. 3. Nishi. I feel like I've been rambling probably more than I should be, so I'm going to try to keep it a little bit more concise for the top 3 here. This one, like honestly, most of the entries on this list was a comment on the last video, so if you want part 3, comment your favorite here. But Nishi is a Bangladeshi folklore, and it's honestly quite interesting. I feel like the best way to describe Nishi is almost like a mix between a skinwalker and Yorona. In Bangladeshi folklore, Nishi is a ghost or spirit that appears at night. The Nishi calls out to a victim at night with the voice of someone close to the victim. The Nishi also takes the form of that voice. However, they keep their distance to make sure that the victim isn't able to fully identify who's calling on them. The Nishi walks very fast and keeps a large distance ahead of the victim, and usually leads the way to a deserted area where it can reveal its true form to the helpless victim, and then almost certainly kill them. One important thing to note about the Nishi is that they cannot call out more than twice. Thus, the Nishi can be identified if it calls out a person's name no more than 2 times and only at night. Much about the Nishi is honestly unknown, but one thing I would recommend is if you hear your name called twice at night and you think you see a loved one or a friend off in the distance, don't follow them. The ambiguity and the sheer simplicity of Nishi is terrifying, but we still have 2 more to go. 2. Vampire. Vampires by far are the most well-known and most documented creatures on this list. This was actually going to be number 1 until I learned about the number 1 I actually put in place, which we'll get to in a minute. Like I mentioned, vampires are well known, so I wanted to focus on attributes about vampires that are potentially less mainstream. First things first, vampires feed on vital essence. Not just blood, vital essence. Generally in the form of blood, but the vital essence could be any life-bearing fluid from a human being. So there's one little idea. Wink, wink. Does that make them scary? No. That honestly makes me feel another way. But I'm not going to talk about that right now. Anyways, I think the scariest part about vampires are how strong they are. Watch Batman vs. Dracula. That's a real animated movie, and it's dope. And he almost beats Batman. Obviously, Batman wins, but only by the skin of his teeth. Dracula and vampires in general are super strong and almost immortal, besides their few pitfalls being sunlight, garlic, and a stake through the heart. In more modern depictions, vampires come across as charismatic and sophisticated, typically being scholarly and well put together. And if you watched our serial killer video, you'll learn that this is the perfect disaster to be swooned by someone who has darker, deeper plans for you. I think my favorite part about vampire lore is how many aspects of it are based in reality and are well documented. For example, during the 18th century, there was a frenzy of vampire sightings in Eastern Europe, with frequent stalkings and grave diggings to identify and to kill these potential revenants. Even government officials engaged in the hunting and stalking of vampires. Despite being called the Age of Enlightenment, during which most folkloric legends were quelled, the belief in vampires increased dramatically, resulting in a mass hysteria throughout most of Europe. The panic began with an outbreak of alleged vampire attacks in East Prussia in 1721. The first officially reported involves a Serbian man who died and then came back to life to ask his son for food. When his son denied him food, he was found dead the following day. Just imagine, it's the 1700s, you're just chilling, your dad's been gone for a day, but that's kind of normal, you didn't realize he was dead. You see your dad come up to you, he's looking all weird, dirty, and he's like, "Hey son, can you get me some 1970s food?" And you're like, "No, get it yourself. What are you talking about? Get out of here, you messy guy." And then he just gets on you, sucks your blood, and you die. Crazy. But not as crazy as our last and final entry. 1. Dragar. Dragar by far is the most powerful, most deadly, most scary mythological creature on this entire list. Dragar is a Scandinavian folklore and is described as the following. Dragar is an undead creature, an animated corpse that inhabits its grave, often guarding buried treasure. The Dragar is a terrifying, zombie-like mythical creature who roams the earth looking for victims. They are infamous resurrected corpses of Viking warriors. These creatures are often described as having a strong stench of rotting flesh and a black and blue skin. Just picture a Viking, but zombified with blue skin and exposed skeleton. That's basically what they look like. As far as smell, without going into detail, just imagine the worst smell you've ever smelt. Rotting flesh, disgusting, just horrible, strong odor. That's just the beginning. The scariest attribute about them is their supernatural strength. Their physical strength is already supernatural and incredibly strong, making them fierce and almost undefeatable warriors to mortals. One of their scariest and potentially strongest supernatural strength is their ability to control the weather, tell the future, and make their way into their victims' dreams. This basically means that if you have any issue at all with one of these creatures, it is a never-ending hell. Even if they're not able to get to you, even if you are consistently running and hiding, you will see them every night in your dreams. They will know where you go as they can predict the future. And if they do find you, their physical strength will overpower you instantly. The sheer aesthetic and the sheer power of these creatures has made them the absolute scariest on this list for me personally. And I really hope they don't exist. I guess what I'm trying to say, and the point of this entire video is, if something smells bad, it's probably a mythical creature. And if somebody smells bad, they're probably a folklore killer. Trust me, bro.